my dreams, I walk free in the city streets. 2,500 days plus 50 weeks, doing hard time for these WikiLeaks, trying to bring the truth out. Man, it only gets you heat, and then they gag you. You don't get to speak, and when you get the leak, they try to hit delete. The masses of the masses, they want the shit discreet. That's why my middle finger's up to these sick elites. Free speech, it's the freedom of press. Take your deepest, darkest secrets, never leave them unsaid. If I'm a thief, then I'm a thief for the people you dread. The people up the red, white and blue, you keep them in bed. Seeing the sheep, keep them asleep, deceiving the weak. Keep seeking the leaks till you cease, and I see your defeat until I'm deceased underneath a freezing red sheet. Become a dead man, then I hit the switch and release. When Goldman Sachs is your creditor, you kill the messenger. Stories axed by the editor, you kill the messenger. Pay to play on the regular, you kill the messenger. Need to silence any questioners, you kill the messenger. And outside my window a figure quickly creeps. They dark as night like some motherfucking chimney sweeps. Whiskey with my Mickey keeps dying in my kidneys weak. Silence of my risky tweets is what the grand jury seeks. I'm wanting peace like 7 years in Tibet. Now rest in peace like 7 years under threat. Cause I've released 7 vaults, they upset. They under the right sentence, but the US still insists to rest. I guess it's a sin to take the truth and disseminate. MLK to Gandhi, take aim and eliminate. And I don't say I'm great, just wanna say what's fake. But if they kill me, a million others will take my place. The CIA's post like a knife the sharpest. All hypocrisy, lies, and heartless. They want to stop me, my life, make my heart quit. Cause democracy dies in the darkness. When Goldman Sachs is your creditor, you kill the messenger. Stories axed by the editor, you kill the messenger. Pay to play on the regular, you kill the messenger. Need to silence any questioners, you kill the messenger. When the vote count is irregular, you kill the messenger. You caught spying on a senator, you kill the messenger. Removing voters from the register, you kill the messenger. Need to silence any questioners, you kill the messenger. In my dreams, I walk free in the city streets. 2,500 days plus 50 weeks, doing hard time for these WikiLeaks, trying to bring the truth out. Man, it only gets you heat, and then they gag you. You don't get to speak, and when you get the leak, they try to hit delete. The masses of the masses, they want the shit discreet. That's why my middle finger's up to these sick elites. Playing on the regular, you kill the messenger. Free speech is the freedom of press. Take your deepest, darkest secrets, never leave them unsaid. If I'm a thief, then I'm a thief for the people you dread. The people want the red, white and blue, you keep them in bed. Seeking the sheep, keep them asleep, deceiving the weak. Keep seeking the leaks till you cease, and I see your defeat until I'm deceased underneath a freezer red sheet. Become a dead man, then I hit the switch and release. When Goldman Sachs is your creditor, you kill the messenger. Outside my window window, a figure quickly creeps. They dark as night like some motherfucking chimney sweeps. Whiskey with my Mickey keeps dying in my kidneys weak. Silence in my risky tweets, what the grand jury seeks. I'm wanting peace, like 7 years in Tibet. Now rest in peace, like 7 years under threat. Cause I've released 7 vaults, they upset, they ended the rape sentence. But the US still insists to rest. I guess it's a sin to take the truth and disseminate. MLK to Gandhi, take him and eliminate. And I don't say I'm great, just wanna say what's fake. But if they kill me, a million others will take my place. The CIA's post like a knife the sharpest. All hypocrisy, lies, and heartless. They want to stop me, my life make my heart quit. Cause democracy dies in the darkness. Cause democracy dies in the darkness. You kill the messenger. You kill the messenger. Democracy dies in the darkness. Darkness. Feeling cold now, but got the heater on. Feeling sold out, even though I'm keeping strong. But can I hold out when every bit of freedom's gone? They want me rolled out, never to sing freedom song. I wanna see the sky, I wanna feel the rain. But gotta keep away from windows, that's some window pane. It's just a shame, couldn't have planned out all our dreams. Now I scream, cause there's a man in the machine. But the train is off the tracks, and damn it's losing steam. I wanna call Christine, I haven't seen since 013. I'm missing life like 3 strikes each night. Seems like 3 nights ain't right. Can't fight, space light, hate life. Wanting to be snake-like, shedding off this gray life. In the dark hit make light, but where I'm headed now is brake lights. Where I'm headed now they break lights. Counting days like brake lights. Feeling weight like brake lights. Had a great life. Brake lights, brake lights, brake lights. Out of place like brake lights. In my face like brake lights. Counting days like brake lights, brake lights, brake lights. Sit here asking, what have I done? If these strings were cut, I'd see my son. And if I could just fly from this place, then I'd hold you in my love embrace. And if I could just speak to you now, I'd renew my vow and be in the now. Is this me in denial? Wanna remove stress from your brow and pay you back some way, somehow. But it's painted black, can see the way back now. But how's the house and how's mine? I doubt the way the media portrays me makes you hate me. But to think you see that daily makes me crazy, that just ain't me.
This is without a doubt going to be this generation's Free Mandela movement. Every single generation must fight again the same battles that previous generations have fought.
Brake lights, counting days like brake lights, 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 brake lights.
My name is Susie Dawson. I am a journalist, an activist, and the president of the Internet Party of New Zealand. Can you please all let me know in chat if you can see and hear me okay? I'll just wait till I get a confirmation from everyone.
Ray can.
Hi.
I can.
Welcome to tonight's Unity for J online vigil in solidarity with Julian Assange. My name is Susie Dawson. I'm a journalist and activist and the president of the Internet Party of New Zealand. I am here tonight with my amazing co-host, the editor-in-chief of Consortium News, Joe Lauria. Hi, Joe.
Hi, Susie. Good to see you again.
You too.
Even under these circumstances.
I'm sorry that it's under these circumstances, but it is extremely gratifying to see how many amazing people have dropped everything to come and be here with us tonight to support Julian and WikiLeaks, press freedom, human rights, and the right of the public to know. So tonight we have a whole host of whistleblowers, activists, journalists, diplomats, academics who will be coming to join the stream to update everybody on Julian's situation and the latest news from this week, and to talk about what we can do together to try and influence this situation in the right direction. So we have here with us to open the stream CIA and ex-CIA analyst, veteran CIA analyst, Ray McGovern. Hi, Ray.
Hi.
Now, I've been watching actually several appearances this week by Joe Lauria on multiple platforms, and I just finished listening to Ray McGovern on the Richie Allen show as well. So, gentlemen, why don't you tell us what you know, share with us what you know about the current situation.
Ray, age before, anyway.
Age before beauty.
Yeah.
Well, I know about the latest full overture by the Ecuadorian government. And I know about Christine, Julian's mother, who, well, people should be able to identify with the pain of a mother who watches what is happening to her son. And I can't help but reiterate my feeling that, we need to do something more than commiserate, more than talk. I revert to my NOAA principle, which is no more awards for predicting rain, awards only for building arcs. And it would be my hope that as we discuss things here, we keep that most in mind and figure out what piece of the arc we can put together and how we really need to float it. And not worry about more rain.
Well, every time we do these vigils, we say it's a very critical moment, and it keeps becoming even more and more critical. We've had quite a lot of news, actually, since the last one, I believe, including the existence of the charges in the Eastern District of Virginia, where Ray and I happen to be right now. And we don't know what they are. We know they exist because there's an attempt to have them unsealed, and the judge hasn't ruled yet. But if the Espionage Act is in fact what they're going to charge, or already have charged Julian Assange with, we could thank the changes over the years in this act. Just to say that people ask, how could Julian Assange, an Australian citizen working outside the U.S., fall under U.S. jurisdiction And if the original 1917 Act was still in force, they would not be able to, because that made it clear in 1917 that the crime against the Espionage Act had to take place on U.S. territory, on a U.S. ship, or on the high seas. But in 1961, some congressman got upset about a State Department official who was blackmailed in Poland, and he pushed for an amendment which made this a global act, part of the extending U.S. Jurisdiction around the whole globe, as they tried to dominate it. And so I've made the point on those appearances that Susie mentioned, this same point that I'm going to make here, that even though legally they have a case against, by the letter of that law, which is a horrible law, they could go after him. The issue is politically, because the Constitution, the First Amendment, the way I see it, and the Pentagon Papers case made it clear, is only about prior restraint. In other words, the government can't tell a newspaper or a TV station to stop printing something before it's published. That's what the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the New York Times and the Washington Post in the Pentagon Papers case. But the judges on that Supreme Court, the majority, wrote an opinion that after publication, they were liable to be prosecuted for publishing classified information. The original act, and continuing until today, makes it a crime to even possess classified information, so that they don't have to prove Julian had anything to do with stealing the emails or any of these classified documents from Chelsea Manning, for example, just that he possessed and disseminated them as a crime. But it's not been prosecuted ever for political reasons, and on the impact it would have on the rest of the media, the mainstream media, because that would make the New York Times and CNN and the Washington Post, all media, all journalists, liable for the prosecution under this act, which, as I say, legally they can. Politically, it's never been something any administration tried to do. For example, Senator Mike Gravel, who was given the papers by Dan Ellsberg and read them in Congress, later published them in Beacon Press in Boston. And he told me personally, because we wrote a book about this together, that he was scared that Nixon could come after him, but they laid off. Same thing happened, and Ray knows more about the Morrison case than I do. Casey wanted to go after the several newspapers that published information, and he backed off. And then there was Obama, who wanted to try to prosecute Julian Assange, but they called it their New York Times problem, which meant that if they prosecuted Assange, which they can do legally, they would have a big problem, because the Times, how could they get away with it if they went after Assange? So they backed off. I'm worried that the Trump administration, Trump in particular, with his manic hatred of the press, a lot of it legitimate as criticism, but he might actually go for this prosecution, especially Pompeo. And what he said about Assange and WikiLeaks makes you wonder that if he is arrested, they could actually try to prosecute him. Now, the death penalty, by the way, in the act is only about war, in times of war. They could argue that in Iraq, the Iraq collateral damage tapes and the Afghan cables could be considered a time of war. So we have to worry a lot about that. And of course, we know now that President Lenin Moreno of Ecuador has said that he made a deal, he's agreement from the UK that they won't extradite Assange to a country that would execute him, not a country that has the death penalty. He's not saying a country, if you have the death penalty, I don't want you to have him extradited, just that they won't execute him, which is chilling to talk about it at all. So that's the scary part we're at right now. Also, we know that Paul Manafort, who did not meet with with Julian Assange in the embassy, despite what Luke Harding has written, did try to make a deal with Moreno at one point. And as I said on one of these programs before, and I said I thought they were negotiating. If Ecuador, a small country, has something the United States, the most powerful country, really wants, well, he's going to hold out to get a good deal. You want something I have? And in fact, from what's been reported, Moreno wanted debt relief and investments. That's what you normally would want in exchange for Assange. Now, maybe a deal has been made because we're closing in, and I'll close right here by saying we're closing in on what could be the most critical moment in all of this, where they're trying to make the circumstances under which Julian Assange is living so terrible that he would leave. But Stefania Maurizi from La Repubblica saw him about 10 days ago in the embassy, and I communicated with her, and she told me she's under the strong impression he won't leave no matter what they do to him. So they're going to have to do a politically, troubling act in terms of the way it'll be seen by entering with the Ecuadorian government's permission to seize him. And we really all hope here, of course, that doesn't happen.
The key problem here I would simply add to what Joe said, is to get evidence that could allow them to detour around the First Amendment. Now, the First Amendment, of course, is the bedrock of our freedom. And so nobody wants to mess with the First Amendment if indeed, as Joe pointed out, the New York Times and the Washington Post would be equally liable. And so what they need to do is find the missing link. And what's the missing link? The missing link is proof that Julian Assange solicited, for example, the emails from the Democratic National Committee, that he was actively witting and eager and told Seth Rich or whoever it was, please give me those things because I want to destroy Hillary. Well, guess what? That evidence doesn't exist. And President Obama, 2 days before he left office, admitted that. He said, the conclusions of the intelligence community with respect to how the Russian hacking got to WikiLeaks are inconclusive. So you have Obama admitting that there were inconclusive conclusions with respect to how WikiLeaks got these documents. I mean, that's a pretty big gap, right? So, in my view, they'll fill in the missing link. It's just too embarrassing for them for Julian to sit there and still receive incredibly damaging leaks like Vault 7. We could talk about that later, and publish them. It's just so damaging that they'll figure out something. They'll figure out something like, aluminum tubes, or maybe yellow cake uranium. It's very easy to fabricate and intercept the message. My full expectation is that they'll do that. And they'll do that and make believe that Julian Assange actively solicited Russian hacking, and that way they can get him and avoid the implications of going after him on First Amendment grounds. So I agree with Joe. I think the situation is really, really delicate. And I'm thinking again that we need to do something more than converse here. And hopefully some wisdom will come out, wisdom that escapes me at the moment.
I would like to talk about action, absolutely, but I'd also like to talk about international law, because there is now a very long list of international laws and rulings and decisions that are being violated by Moreno, by Ecuador, by UK, and by proxy, the US. So we have 2 UN rulings in favor of Julian Assange and WikiLeaks, stating that yes, Julian has been arbitrarily detained, that he must be given safe passage to realize his asylum in Ecuador, and compensated. We have the Inter-American Court on Human Rights decision, which I've had confirmed from WikiLeaks' legal team is a legally binding decision upon Ecuador as a member state, which again ratifies that Julian is being arbitrarily detained, that he should be released, and that he should be compensated. We have the 1953, I believe, Refugee Convention on Refugees, which guarantees not just that someone shouldn't be executed, but actually preserves their life and their liberty and their human rights. That has been consistently violated throughout the last 8 years. We've also seen when Julian was given diplomatic status by Ecuador after being made an Ecuadorian citizen, that the United Kingdom has refused to respect that diplomatic status, which in itself is yet another violation. So I'd like your commentary, Ray, and also Joe, if you have, I'm sure, 2 cents to put in about this. How is it that so many precedents, so many legal precedents can be completely, abjectly ignored by the West in this situation?
I could tell you because it's happened so many times before with the United States. And just one example, the 2003 invasion of Iraq. There was no UN Security Council resolution authorizing that. The now late Secretary General at the time, Kofi Annan, who died just a few months ago, he was badgered by a BBC interviewer whether the invasion was illegal, and he ultimately said yes. And then the Americans, led by John Bolton, who was the UN ambassador at the time, and I was covering UN headquarters, I was there, made his life hell. And then the oil for food scandal erupted, which really had little to do with Kofi Annan and had to do more with member states. And he paid a big price just for saying that the invasion of Iraq was illegal, which it certainly was. So the U.S., and Ray can expound on this if he wants to, has a long history of ignoring international law when it suits them. I mean, it's a joke. The idea that the U.S. would let international law stop them, and they won't let them. And the UK is pretty much the same. And Ecuador seems to be behaving that way as well. I mean, when someone gets political asylum, they have to prove that they are in danger if they go back to the country, or in this case, even go out into the street, because they could be arrested and extradited to the U.S. And that's why the previous government of Ecuador gave him political asylum, because his life was and his freedom was in danger. And once that happens, you can't kick this person out if they're still in danger. And the danger's grown. We know that there are charges against him in the United States. And we know that UK will extradite him. There'll be a fight over that extradition, by the way. People skip over that point. I mean, Julian's lawyers certainly will fight that, maybe in the European Court of Human Rights and at the International Court of Justice, maybe. I mean, they will try to stop that extradition, but the US and Britain seem to have a way, as their history has shown us, of getting their way when it comes to these international legal matters. So he cannot be kicked out. That's against, I believe, international refugee or asylum law, that if there's still a tangible threat to him, and it's greater now than ever, they can expel him. So international law is a plaything in the hands of American policymakers. It has been forever, and it's not going to stop being here.
Well, I would agree, Joe. It has been pretty much forever, because we are, after all, the sole indispensable country in the world. You know, that makes all other countries, by definition, what? Dispensable, right? We have vassals like the UK. And the UK has a rich history of detaining people without trial. Several of my Irish uncles can tell you about that, okay? And they can tell you about what it's like to be in British captivity, as Julian Assange would inevitably be, as the courts fought about whether he should be allowed out of jail. With respect to international law, well, there was a catalyst of great significance in March of 2003, as Joe mentioned, and that was that we started what Nuremberg Tribunal called a war of aggression, okay? Now, Nuremberg was very careful, and they said, now, starting a war of aggression is to commit the supreme international crime, differing from other war crimes only insofar as it contains the accumulated evil of the whole. Whoa, accumulated evil. Think torture, think kidnapping, think black prisons, think all that stuff, okay? And it all happened. Now, just to mention torture, Alberto Gonzalez, who was our President Bush's lawyer at the time, he called the Geneva Conventions, the sacrosanct Geneva Conventions going way back before World War II. He said, well, they're sort of obsolete. They're quaint, and you can do whatever you like, Mr. Bush. And so he decided, and this was the result of Gonzalez's and Cheney's recommendation, we will treat detainees humanely, as appropriate, and as consistent with military necessity, period, end quote. That's not what Geneva says. My God. And you know what happened for all that. So I guess what we have to say here is that although there is such a thing as international law, and the United States view might makes right, vassals like the UK will bow and scrape to stay in good odor with the United States. And I've not seen it so bad in all of my years, which actually are longer years than Joe Laurier's.
I'm getting there, Ray. Thanks. So Susie's bowed out. Let's bring in Margaret if you'd like to join in. I see you left, so that's an entree.
Yes, hi, how are you? It's good to
Fine,
be back.
Margaret. Good to see you.
Under sad circumstances. I think it's interesting that the events of the last few weeks, which you've mentioned, this smear in the Guardian, which they had to know was not true. So let's just remember the Guardian published the visitor logs from the Ecuadorian embassy, and Manafort's name wasn't on them. The building is under constant surveillance. If he'd ever been in the building, there'd be pictures of him. So it's a very obvious lie. I think it's interesting that the propaganda has been so all-encompassing, so constant, that an obvious lie like that can be told, and it isn't questioned by the rest of the media. Did the rest of the corporate media point out any of the things I just said?
Nope.
Excuse me, that there was no proof, actually proof that he was not there, that Manafort was not there. And I think is it coincidence that this story appears at the same time that Julian is indicted, or that there's news of this indictment? I don't think so. I think all of these things are tied together. The corporate media working with the surveillance state in the US working with the surveillance state in the UK is very chilling to me. And of course, what they've done to Julian, they've made it difficult for people to defend him, because he is the man to blame for Trump being president. That's what people have been told over and over again for months, for 2 years now. Trump is president. Trump's victory was illegitimate. He won because WikiLeaks, or did the Russians steal and give to WikiLeaks, or WikiLeaks steal and give to the Russians? I don't even know anymore. But he is blamed for this. And so there are people who would have, a few years ago, would have defended him, who would be hard pressed to do so now. So that makes all of this very difficult. But we did talk about taking action. I know he has good attorneys. I'm hoping, is there a possibility, has it been discussed for him to ask the UK for asylum in case he's dragged out of the embassy? Now, I know they wouldn't want to give it to him, but it could at least embarrass them, perhaps. I don't know. I was just wondering if that topic has ever come up. But I think we have to keep doing what we're doing, and I hope people in the UK who are on the ground there, who could demonstrate, who could protest, who could just show up in mass. I mean, let's look at what's happening now in Paris. We forget what happens when there's mass action. People there have forced Macron to backpedal. And I think if there were something huge to happen in London, it could undo some of the propaganda. It could force people who have just conformed and just gone along with these lies to begin to question them. So those are just my observations now. But I think this is a time to be bold and to think outside the box to try to save this man, because if you look at his enemies, and if you look at who wants to lock him up and lock him away forever, it's clear why he's important, and it's clear why we have to defend him.
Well, they want to lock him up because he's directly threatening their interests. I'm talking about individuals inside the CIA, the NSA, the Defense Department, the Foreign Office, GCHQ, MI5 and MI6, people, business, big, powerful business interests. He's a public enemy number one. Well, he's their enemy. He's not public enemy number one. He's on the side of the public. If you oppose Julian Assange, you're on the side of the state against the people. It's a very simple way to put it. Now, it's really interesting you brought up Paris, because that is exactly right. That shows time and time again, history is full of examples when the people really do get angry and organized. They are terrified. And they will drop a new petrol tax. They will backpedal, as you say. And this is what we need to see for Assange. Now, you also mentioned, interesting, that there were people who once supported Julian and now don't. Today at the National Press Club here in Washington, I went to an event where Alan Rusbridger, who was the editor of The Guardian during the whole period of the WikiLeaks, working with The Guardian, and then Snowden was there being interviewed by Marty Baron, the executive editor of the Washington Post. And Rusbridger said he would go to court if Assange has a trial. He would defend, he would be a witness in his defense only during the period in which they worked together on the WikiLeaks. But since the Russians gave him these stolen documents, these emails, he wouldn't be able to do it anymore. So that's a very good example right there of a guy who used to be very powerful as the editor of The Guardian. He's left 3 years ago. He was 20 years the editor, saying that the Russians changed everything. And in that conversation, I was telling Ray before we went on the air here that both Barron and Rusbridger alternated between saying the Russians did it, and then they would say, well, if the Russians gave it to Assange, then which one is it? So Ray puts forward the idea that they're just covering themselves in either eventuality. People can quote them, whatever side they're on that issue. So Paris is a key moment, and somehow the public has to know that Assange is on their side against these people who are screwing them, and they got to go out and force against him, and that's what we're trying to drum up here, basically. Speaking of drums and banging pots and things like that.
Completely agree. Completely agree. We need to have a mass mobilization. It's going to have to happen in London, and people are going to have to show that they do have the power when they come together, precisely as we've been seeing in France and now in multiple other European countries. Just quickly, there is a lot of love in chat being expressed for you, Joe, and many people linking to your recent RT appearances. Also for you, Margaret, and Ray, it looks like you have a couple of friends in there as well. One person has asked a question. They've said they've heard that Lenin Moreno is doing a deal to basically sell Assange to the US for money. And they want to know, is that true? And what does the panel have to say about that? And just before you answer, I would love to add to the stream Chris Hedges, who is with us, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist. Chris, are you able to?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes. Hold on 1 second. I think we have maxed out our panel, so I'm just going to step a couple of our team down from panelists. Right, I can hear you, but I cannot see you yet, Chris.
Okay, I'm here.
Bear with me 1 second. We also have George Zamuli. Okay, Chris, you should be on panel now. Is your camera working?
I think my camera is...
Ah, there you go. We can see you and we can hear you. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, no, thanks for doing it. I mean, I just checked in, so I heard a little bit about what Joe and the other people said. And I can't reiterate enough that this is really the last mechanism we have to not only protect Julian Assange, but to protect the possibility of publishers to disseminate material on the inner workings of these corporate entities, these corporate states. I worked as an investigative journalist for the New York Times, and I still have colleagues that are there, and they are quite blunt about the fact that investigative journalism into the inner workings of power have been frozen completely because of wholesale surveillance. And government officials, because they know they're monitored, journalists, because they know they're monitored, can no longer shine a light into the inner workings of power. The only mechanism left by which we can understand, frankly, the crimes that are being committed by the powerful, by the elites, are through leaks. That's what Jeremy Hammond did, and I used the leaks that he provided, the 5 million emails from Stratfor in my own lawsuit against Barack Obama. They were actually pivotal because there was an exchange between member of the Homeland Security and the private security firm trying to find a jihadist website that had referred to or linked to a group called Days of Rage, which is about election reform, and was included eventually as one of the plaintiffs in my case, so that they could charge them with terrorism laws. The whole exposure of the material that Chelsea Manning leaked, the war crimes that were leaked, the duplicity of Hillary Clinton in her campaign, and there was there's a long list. Joe may have gone over it. I mean, everything from promoting Trump as the candidate to taking in 3 speeches over $600,000 from Goldman Sachs, a sum so large it can be only described as a bribe. The use of the Democratic National Committee to thwart the Sanders campaign. And when Joe was on my show, he was talking about how, and also that exposed how New York Times reporters were having their material vetted. Her two-faced, very hypocritical stance, saying one thing to Wall Street and another thing to the voters. Does the public have a right to know this stuff? And as somebody who, throughout my career, 15 of them with the New York Times, often published classified material, that is the mechanism by which we hold the powerful accountable. Take that mechanism away, and tyranny, corruption runs rampant, as of course it is at the moment. So this case is, with Julian, extremely important, not only because he's being persecuted for what in a democratic society is laudable, but also because of the implications it will have down the road. So the Trump administration will use this legal precedent without question towards more mainstream publications, which, as Joe said, have turned their back very short-sightedly on Julian. But yeah, I think that the bankruptcy of the institutions, including the press, the failure of the court system to have any kind of real independence, certainly the American court system is a wholly owned subsidiary of the corporate state, means that all we have left is what we have seen in the streets of Paris. And it works. I mean, people forget that it's not just Macron, but it was Sarkozy, who was a complete cretin, was really held in check by the French labor unions, the French farmers, the students. And this, the French have a history of this kind of militancy. We used to have it many decades ago. It was really wiped out quite effectively, but we have to regain it. It's the only tool we have left to protect ourselves.
Absolutely. Ray, you want to weigh in on that?
Just to say amen, amen, amen.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you, Chris, how, well, I can't ask you this because there's really no answer, but what would it take to spur that kind of reaction from the American people like we see in France? France is totally different. They react. Sarkozy began this neoliberal British-American policy that began with Thatcher and Reagan, and that the French had resisted. Even Mitterrand still had nationalized banks and this type of thing. There was a kind of a socialism in France, and they resisted this Anglo-American economic system, but it has wholly taken over France, and particularly now with Macron being appointed essentially by bankers to lead the country. So, and the French people there, they know their interests, and they've just had them reverse a policy simply because they're on the streets. How could we envision this happening here? How could this happen here? What would have to happen?
Well, part of the problem is the complete corruption of the systems of information, not just the press, but academia, the shutting out of all critical voices. That's why you have public broadcasting, so that people are not beholden to the power elites, to business interests, have a voice. Now, because I think PBS gets only 18% of its funding from the federal government, they depend. Literally, the Koch brothers are a huge contributor to public television. And this has sanitized the airwaves. So you know, the whole idea of myself as being some kind of a radical critic is nuts. But it shows you how perverted the environment is. That you know, I'm basically a Swedish socialist. You know, 1970s Swedish socialist. I'm, you know, a Keynesian. I had Marx. I gave a talk at the University of Winnipeg, and the head of the economics department got up as soon as I finished and said, he's just a radical Keynesian. They were, Canada is still a healthy academic environment. You know, the fact that voices like mine or yours or Ray's or anyone else are essentially shut out, I mean, you know, is extremely disturbing and shows you how degraded systems of information have become. And I would have to say the electronic systems of information, I mean, CNN, MSNBC, it's all info entertainment. It's all court gossip. There's no journalism done anymore. And that's why they can't pay. That's number one, why their approval ratings are so low among the American public, and they deserve to be. But secondly, why they can't penetrate that kind of hardcore 40% around Trump, because all they do is sit like courtiers at Versailles and talk about, you know, which mistress Louis XIV took into the bedchamber, and ignore the real suffering that has been inflicted on, at this point, over half the country that's living in poverty or near poverty. And I really look at this bankrupt, self-identified liberal elite as responsible for the rise of these proto-fascist movements. We see it in Germany with Merkel. We see it in Hungary. We see it in Poland. We see it with Nigel Farage, Le Pen. I mean, it's everywhere. I mean, it's the figures like Macron who, in the end, empower these fiercely anti-democratic movements because they have surrendered to international bankers and corporate power, abandoning the citizenry, and by doing that, they have eviscerated the rule of law. I talked to Ralph Nader quite a bit, but I remember Ralph saying to me a while ago, you know, in the end, people like you and me are actually conservatives because on the political spectrum, because what we are calling is for the restoration of the rule of law. And what we are seeing with the persecution of Julian is shredding, a destruction of the rule of law, which is vital to maintaining an open society.
And it could very well backfire on them, particularly in the media. And it's by design. It's a very good point you made about the Koch brothers. I mean, that was, from their point of view, a brilliant move to go in there and neutralize PBS by essentially taking it over. And
well, they fund the news. They fund the NewsHour, which is why it's so boring. I mean, it's good if you have insomnia.
But the liberal class, as you point out, is very much responsible for this by taking on these neoliberal economic policies to destitute so many people. They're creating the backlash that we're now seeing, and we have no organized popular left to rise up as well, or in place of, or at least alongside of this popular right. So we're in a really tough situation here to be.
Yeah, it's very different from the 1930s. I mean, and certainly different from the turn of the century when the United States had powerful socialist, anarchist, communist, militant labor unions, the anarcho-syndicalists like the Wobblies. And we forget the press, too. The press was extremely diversified. Appeal to Reason, which was a socialist newspaper, Debs wrote it for it, had the fourth highest circulation in the country. It was a very different, and the consolidation of systems of information into the hands of a few corporations, Viacom, General Electric, Sinclair, all of whom have, narrowed the acceptable range of opinions. Kind of what Dorothy Parker once said about Katharine Hepburn's emotional range as an actress. It goes from A to B. And that's kind of what you see in the press. So there's no debate about endless war. There's no debate about the fact that we've lost the war in Afghanistan, the creation of failed states. It's all about tactics. You know, do we just bomb Syria, or do we bomb Syria and put boots on the ground, as if those are the two alternatives in terms of dealing with the Assad regime. So it's nuts. But it's stunted and destroyed. I mean, it's left really quite it's robbed people of the vocabulary by which they can even ask the question. And of course, that's the intent.
And of course, the liberal class will never blame themselves for having a major role in creating this situation. They'll blame Julian Assange, WikiLeaks, the Russians, anybody but themselves.
Right. And then you get Hillary Clinton trotting off to Europe, thinking she can outright the far right by saying you should build more walls to keep immigrants out. I mean, just the utter bankruptcy of the Democratic Party and the self-identified, because they're not really liberals, the self-identified liberal establishment on display recently with Michelle Obama's banal memoir. I mean, I watched the same thing happened in Yugoslavia with the death of Tito and the mismanagement and the inability to be effective in terms of addressing the social inequality and eventually the economic breakdown of Yugoslavia. It vomited up these figures like Radovan Karadzic, just the way we vomited up Trump or Orban in Hungary or Boris Johnson in Britain or anywhere else. History doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. I can't remember who said that. It may have been Mark Twain. But it's true. I mean, you have to learn from the past. The fact that the fascists in Weimar in 1928 were polling in the single digits. Then you have the 1929 crash. Ebert and the Social Democrats, the kind of liberal establishment of their day, caters to the international banking system and imposes draconian forms of austerity, including abolishing unemployment insurance. And that, of course, gave rise to the Nazi Party. As every historian, Kershaw, Evans, and anyone else who's written on that period has pointed out, when you create that economic distress, that social stagnation, that rupturing of social bonds, that inability to actualize yourself within the society for a life of meaning and dignity, then you get these dark pathologies which express themselves in a myriad of ways. My latest book, America, the Farewell Tour, looks at them: the opioid crisis, suicide, gambling, but also these dark political pathologies are a consequence of every decayed society. And when you look at decaying societies, and you can go all the way back, I study classics, you can go all the way back to ancient Rome or even Greece, then you find the same kinds of distortions. I mean, the idea that you can maintain a democracy in an oligarchic system, this is something that Aristotle addressed, a few thousand years ago. And he fully understood that once you create an oligarchic system, your choice is either revolution or tyranny. And we've reached that point. That's where we are.
And unlike in Weimar, as you were pointing out earlier, while the liberal bourgeois class was responsible for a lot of the failure, there was a obviously very vibrant left-wing Marxist, socialist demonstrations, fighting in the street with the Nazis. They were the real threat that many think the big business in Germany needed the Nazis to help put down.
Well, that's what. Sure,
but we don't have that now.
No, we don't. We don't.
We have this right-wing populism. Who's going to go on the street for Julian then? Will we see right-wing populists doing that if there's no left-wing mobilization for this purpose? Would we want that?
Yeah. I mean, you have a libertarian element that on issues like this, they're good. I mean, at this point, it would have to be something that would erupt like the yellow vest, that there's just a kind of spontaneous eruption. Whether that will happen for Julian is problematic. We're certainly barreling towards another economic crisis. And we're watching the volatility now in the stock market, which is absurdly valued because companies are valued for projected profits. And that's the whole goes back to the .com industry, but the fracking industry, which doesn't make any money, the Google, Apple, they're all valued on projected. They're not real. It's not real. And there's nothing about stock price being actually tied to value. So, and they're gambling, just like they did before. It's an economy built where they are extracting money primarily from debt peonage. They don't create anything, not in the traditional capitalist way. So we're at a very volatile and dangerous moment. But I think that unfortunately, on the issue of Julian, for many people who are sitting with their mouths half open watching Basketball Wives, I don't have a TV, so I don't know what people watch now. This moment is extremely dangerous, but it's abstract in a way that economic suffering, economic punishment is not. They don't always know why it's happening, why there is an economic collapse, but it affects them immediately and directly, and this will affect them, but it's not immediate and it's not direct.
Susie?
Yeah, I've got a few thoughts on that front, actually. So just one thing quickly with relating to the DNC publications, something that very few people realize, but if they actually go in and read the documents that WikiLeaks published, they'll discover that WikiLeaks did publish information that was detrimental to the Trump campaign, because they published the entire DNC opposition research on Trump, which included all of the super PAC information, the donors. I've studied it myself. I've learned a great deal about who Trump rubs shoulders with and who he accepts money from as a result of those publications. So it's actually untrue. It's just simply untrue that WikiLeaks was selective in their publishing of those files. There is plenty of information about Trump in WikiLeaks. Simply go in and type Trump and press enter. There's mountains of stuff. Similarly, there is mountains of information that is detrimental to Russia. And I say that sitting in Russia. There's 660,000 files about Russia that have been published by WikiLeaks. There is information about security operations, about security companies. If you really wanted to study, for the purpose of tracking even Trump or Russia, you would have a better chance at finding valuable information about them in WikiLeaks than you would in almost any other publication. But the media don't want to tell you that. They don't want you using WikiLeaks. So most people do not realize that at all. But WikiLeaks has made everybody who has power and wealth fair game, no matter what country they're from and no matter what political affiliation they have. And that just takes me back, Joe, to your question. I can see Ray smiling at me, so I know he knows about this. Joe, your question a moment ago about, do we want the Tommy Robinson crowd in the streets in the UK? Are we going to see that? And I would say to that poverty has no ideology. No matter what people's political affiliations or beliefs are, they are uniformly victimized by poverty and by the social circumstances which Chris is describing. And we actually have several of our core team who are in France and who are French and who have been caught up in the recent events in France. And what they are reporting to us is that everybody is in the streets. It is not a left wing, not a right wing. It is a class war. And that class warfare is those who are hurting versus those who are not. And it's almost like adherence to a rigid political ideology or affiliation is a manifestation of privilege. That when you have the privilege of determining who you will align yourself with based on ideological grounds, that is a privilege of comfort. But when you get to the level that we are seeing these people at, that flies out the window. They just want food. They just want social services, healthcare and education. They don't care whether it is the left or the right or whoever is going to give it to them. They just want it, and they want it now. And when you get to that level of desperation, I think these rigid ideological lines, the divisions that we've seen particularly manifest in the US since 2016, but also that have been the perpetuation of divide and conquer agendas for generations, specifically to keep people separate and so that they can't realize their full power en masse, the way we've seen in France recently. I think if people get desperate enough, if people get to the point where they understand that the struggle of Julian and WikiLeaks is inherently interlinked with the struggles of the 99% against the 1%, that then yes, we may well see the Tommy Robinson crowd on the streets, but we'll see them beside the Catholic workers, we'll see them beside the socialists, and that may be what gives us the critical mass that we need. And in some ways, that's what this movement and the work that we've done over the last 6 months has been about, which is saying that fighting for Julian is the important thing. Julian and WikiLeaks, I've said it before, but I'll say it again, they are the bulwark that has protected the entire independent media sphere. They have created a vacuum that has allowed many of us to operate in. There is 800 intelligence agents working every day, probably more than if you include private subcontractors, to take down Julian and WikiLeaks. And if they are successful, I'm sure they'll have a hell of a party, but the next day they will begin work on their next targets, and there will be next targets. They will not give up and go home. And so it is in all of our interest to protect Julian and WikiLeaks and to keep that bulwark in place.
I think everything you say is right, is very true, and I think that's part of the problem with the ideological purity among the left in the United States, that we are going to have to make alliances over basic social and economic issues with people whose politics are not like ours, maybe even repugnant to ours. That said, when societies break down, Marx writes about it, there is always, that was his anger towards what he called the lumpen proletariat. There is always that segment of the society that will willingly do the dirty work of the state. That's who fascists are. That's who the Basiji were when I covered Iran. They're always there. And the state essentially empowers them to carry out extrajudicial violence. And they are an element that we are going to have to deal with, especially in the United States, given the proliferation of weapons and the rise of militarized hate groups, which are all over the place. And of course, it's short-sighted, because the thing that has driven them into the arms of these proto-fascist organizations is the same economic distress that has affected everybody else. But the ruling elites in times of social unrest and economic turmoil throughout history have always been quite good at empowering those elements. And as Joe said, when the business community, which finds Trump an embarrassment, but when they feel under the pressure, they will always make alliances with these fascist forces. Many people forget that it was the Social Democrats that created the Freikorps to break the Spartacus uprising and the uprisings on the left in the 1920s in Germany, which was the antecedent that became the Nazi Party. And that's what. And that's why the liberal class is always so dangerous. Gramsci also got it, and so did Luxemburg, because that bourgeois liberal element in times of distress, however unpalatable and unsavory it may be, will always side with the fascists.
Yeah, the thing is, I see fascists on both sides, because coming through Occupy, we were targeted by Hillary Clinton's State Department. We were targeted by Obama's administration. I watched myself and many other activists have our lives completely dismantled and ruined by the security state, which Trump has inherited and which Trump may wield now. So I see to me, Trump is just a mafia family, and Clinton is a mafia family, and it's the competition of the mafia family. So I don't put a whole lot of stock in them. I just think it's really a puppet show personally. But particularly having studied the Snowden files, I look beneath and I see 20 years of NSA strategizing, and they are strategizing for a global network. That's what they call it, their global network. And they fully intend to, and have to a certain degree been successful at controlling every single element of human society, whether it's education, whether it's the technology sector and the strategic development of technology, and to what degree that's become accessible to the public, to information and media systems, to economics. They have what they call the Global Economic Security Day, where they work with all of the global economic interests under the guise of security. So this is it's an international fascist machine that is it's an architecture, it's an infrastructure that is, to a certain degree, wielded by whichever political faction happens to be in power. But in those same NSA documents, they actually describe themselves as being impervious to political perturbations brought about by whoever the population chooses to vote for in any given 4 or 8 year cycle. So they are fully aware of their own omnipotence in that regard. And that is why, you know, in the counterinsurgency doctrine, the political sphere is just one pillar, the security sphere is another, and the economics is the third. And the only thing that can topple all three pillars is the foundation, which is information. And so WikiLeaks has attacked that base of all three pillars. They have gone after the banks, they've gone after the economic pillar, they've gone after the CIA and the security pillar, and they've gone after the political. And that is what has made WikiLeaks so dangerous, because they are the first organization to threaten all three fundamental pillars of the, what I consider to be truly fascist global system of control. And Ray, you're smiling too much to not have something to say about that. You worked inside these agencies for decades.
No, I really don't have a lot to add to the wisdom that has been shared here. Earlier on, I wanted to compliment you on straightening out the impression that Julian Assange and WikiLeaks just went after certain people. It didn't go after others. So just went after Democrats and not after Republicans. I guess this might be a good segue into just saying that it is, in my view, fact that the revelations included in the Democratic National Committee emails may have affected the election, okay? So you have to sort of distinguish between these concepts. Did WikiLeaks' release of the DNC documents affect the election? I think it did. Now, there's a big jump between saying that and that the Russians did it, because we have to keep remembering that the link between the Russian hacking, which we can prove forensically didn't happen, the Russian hacking and WikiLeaks, there is no link there. And the President of the United States, Barack Obama, said so on the 18th of January, 2017. So it's become sort of clear in my own mind. I guess that's why I'm mentioning this, that no, it is, it is probably true that a lot of people voted against Hillary Clinton because those emails showed, and you know, this is clear, showed that she cheated Bernie Sanders out of his rightful claim to the nomination. Now, also, even the CIA acknowledges that WikiLeaks is a paragon of not fooling around with sources, but publishes documentary evidence without fooling around with it. Okay, what does that mean? That means that if the Russians or the Julian Assange wanted to pick the best carrier, or the best purveyor of this information with the best reputation for not shading them, they would pick Julian Assange. And indeed, the unparalleled left-handed compliment that the intelligence community assessment of 6 January gave to WikiLeaks was, the Russians chose WikiLeaks. The Russians chose WikiLeaks because of WikiLeaks' reputation for never changing documentary evidence. So it's a long way of saying that for people who haven't followed this as closely as some of us have, there's a big distinction between what Julian Assange did to allow people to know what went on, like the truth, like these emails, and the notion that it was the Russians that were involved in giving it to him. We know that it wasn't, and we can prove it forensically, but nobody will listen to us.
Well, I just wanted to jump in here. I wanted to say something else about the election. You know, it's possible also that Trump cheated Hillary. The way our elections are run in the United States, there is a lot of vote theft. So we are not sure. I don't feel confident. Those states that flipped that we keep hearing about, and they blame the Green Party. We don't know if Republicans, the usual vote thieves with voter suppression and actual vote theft, stole the election from her. But it's interesting that the Democrats won't say anything about that. And that is another aspect of the corruption of the liberal class in this country, that they will allow themselves to be cheated. In the end, there's consensus. In the end, they're all allied with the same forces. You haven't heard the Democratic Party talk about the Electoral College, the fact that in this country, the loser can be the winner. Hillary Clinton hasn't said all this talk about Russia, WikiLeaks, the Green Party. They have never talked about this Electoral College. They've never said we want to count the votes. It was Green Party that insisted on trying to count votes. So it could be that the release of this information peeled off some votes for Trump. That's a possibility. But I think we always have to talk about the inherent corruption. And it makes me so angry when I hear about the Russians stealing our democracy, because first of all, I don't think it's true. And secondly, we don't have a democracy. But these are the people who are after Julian, the people who are corrupt, like Hillary Clinton. Chris Hedges asked, what are people watching these days? Well, for the last week, they've been watching George H.W. Bush's funeral and debate whether or not, it was wonderful that Hillary wouldn't look at Trump, and why did the Obamas shake Trump's hand? They should or shouldn't have shaken his hand. That sort of nonsense where they're all together. Trump is just on the outs because he has bad manners. That's the only reason. That's the citadel of the people sitting at that funeral, of everything that's wrong with this country and with the world. But that's never talked about. And that's why the Julian Assanges are beaten up so badly. That's why they're all dedicated to getting rid of someone like him, because he exposes them all.
You know, Margaret,
can I just jump in here, Joe?
George, I want to introduce you.
Okay, great.
After I make my point,
Okay,
I just want to say that the death and burial of U.S. presidents is useful to expose the myth-making function of the corporate media. They do it all the time, but you don't notice it. But when it comes to a president's death, you see they've abandoned any pretense of journalism and completely mythologize a person. George, welcome to the show.
Hi, Joe. How are everybody? I mean, my view is that at the moment, on the one hand, things are very grim for Julian. There's no question that Lenin Moreno wants to throw him out of the embassy, and he's going to find some way to do it. I think he will succeed, whether he's going to raise some issue that he's suffering from poor health and that he has to throw him out because he needs medical treatment, or he'll claim that Julian is violating the protocols that that have been stipulated, but he will get him out. But then, once he's in the hands of the British authorities, the situation may well change in Julian's favor. I think both the May government and the Trump administration will be making a huge political mistake in going after him. There will be no political support for May in going after Julian. May is an extremely unpopular prime minister. It's very hard to see how she can even survive for very much longer. She's hated both for her austerity policies and for her incompetent bungling of the Brexit negotiations. So for her now to come along and say, well, I'm going to seek to placate Washington by handing over Julian, I think will go down very badly. And the courts, which generally tend to follow public opinion, will not look upon her request with great favor, because they will obviously ask the government, why exactly is Julian going to be extradited and not, say, the editor of The Guardian? Why pick on him, not on anybody else? And the May government, already very unpopular, I think is going to have difficulties coming up with any good explanation. The same goes for the Trump administration. I mean, Trump has been fooling his supporters for quite a while. I mean, he's been showing what he's the regular guy, the blue-collar billionaire. He's on the side of the people. But essentially, his administration is George W. Bush's administration. There's no real difference between them. I mean, he's doing the same thing: tax cuts, endless interventions. I mean, it's just George W. Bush. And look at the people that he has hired to staff his administration: neoconservatives, one and all. So if he now goes after Julian Assange, I think he's going to lose a lot of support, because those supporters, to the extent that they know about Assange, and they do know quite a bit about it, they followed the 2016 election, they rather feel that Julian Assange helped Trump win the election. It will not go down well with his supporters. And given how precarious his own position is, because he has his core supporters, he has a huge negative following, in the country. There's a lot of people hate him. He has already a tough re-election fight on his hands. Going after Julian Assange will be politically catastrophic for him. So I think that at the moment things are bleak for Julian, but they may improve once the administration moves ahead with its extradition request. I think it's going to go badly for Trump and for May.
I'd be curious to know what, like Margaret and Joe and a few others, I'm not sure it's going to be catastrophic for Trump. I can't speak to May and Britain, but Trump really has taken the role of a cult leader rather than a politician. And the Republican Party has essentially become a cultic party, where everything that Trump says, and he lies, of course, repeatedly, is done to fulfill the emotional needs of this kind of hardcore 35–40%. But, I could be wrong. I don't know, Margaret, what you think.
Yeah, I think Trump's people like Trump, and that's very interesting. They don't care a lot about most of his policies. I don't see them having an opinion about Julian Assange. They want to defend their guy, and that's Trump. So I don't think it will hurt him. I think Russiagate has, and that's the whole point of it, has tied his hands in many ways. So it's hard to know if he's doing things, taking on certain policies because he wants to, or because he's already been labeled a Russian dupe, a Manchurian candidate. So it's hard to say. I don't think it will hurt Trump. I think it'll be interesting to see. It'll expose the so-called resistance who happen to love state power if it's anything against somebody they don't like, and they don't like Julian Assange. So I don't think it would hurt Trump. But speaking of cults, I mean, I think the Hillary Clinton is the one with the equally bad cult following. I've never seen anybody who lost because of her own arrogance, corruption, and incompetence. I mean, this was somebody who raised $1 billion. She raised more money than Trump did, and then she nickeled and dimed the get out the vote effort. And assuming he really did win those states, she lost because of her own bad decision making. So it's hard to say with all these cultish people we have leading our so-called democracy.
There is a sorry to break in, there is an element of Trump support that he will lose if he does whatever he ends up doing to Julian. And I'll just quickly screen share and just show you this one tweet here. This is from Cassandra Fairbanks. Now, Cassandra quite famously was a Bernie supporter a Bernie Sanders supporter, and she went from supporting Bernie Sanders to Trump because of Hillary Clinton and Hillary Clinton's persecution of WikiLeaks and Julian Assange. And she says here, if Julian Assange is arrested and Trump tries to play dumb and ignore it, I am going to go nuclear. And she has 915 likes on that tweet. So I think there is that. Trump got votes from the hardcore evangelical Christian right wing. He got the traditional conservative votes, but he also did, and I personally believe this turned the tables for him, he did get a chunk of Bernie support who just couldn't bring themselves to vote for Hillary. And I think that would be the element that would be first to abandon him.
Ray.
Yeah, I very much hesitate to disagree with George on anything. But on this one, I am in disagreement. I think that we're proceeding on a false premise here. It is as though we all think that Trump is in charge. Trump is not in charge. People who are after Julian Assange are in charge. I'm talking about the deep state, talking about the CIA, NSA, FBI. They've really been in charge here, and there are multiple examples showing that. So whether Trump cares about it or not, he's going to be led by people like Pompeo and others who may even believe that, as Pompeo has said, that Julian Assange is a demon. Now, remember, Pompeo believes in demons, so that's part of his structure, okay? And when he says that this is a non-state hostile intelligence agency, well, he's made up a whole new legal entity. So there's no rhyme or reason for these folks except that Julian Assange completely embarrasses them every time someone leaks, not hacks and leaks, like the fellow who leaked Vault 7. The Vault 7 documents are incredibly damaging to the CIA. And you know, there was a deal in the making. Most people don't know this. Julian Assange, through his lawyer, if I can believe John Solomon, writing for The Hill, and he's quite good, Julian said, look, you know, I can show you that it wasn't certain state actors that leaked that. I can give you the evidence for that. Would you like it? And and people like Senator Warner, who's really after Assange, says, well, I don't know if I like that or not. In any case, they set up the deal. Julian and a lawyer for the Justice Department acting on behalf of the CIA, okay? They wanted to mitigate the damage from Vault 7. Now, Vault 7 was described by Julian as being more encompassing and more dangerous than all the material that Edward Snowden brought out into Hong Kong. That's a lot, okay? So the CIA said, let's make a deal. Now, if Julian could just agree to sanitize some of these things about Vault 7, and maybe we could give him a limited immunity, or maybe we could make up some sort of deal, okay? Now, as soon as James Comey, who's very much in the news today, as soon as he heard about this, he called Julian's lawyer and said, stand down, no deal. We don't want to know about this, and we certainly don't want to know your technical information that it was not a state actor that hacked or leaked. So what we have here is a really, really strong hatred on the part of John Brennan and those folks who put billions, literally billions of dollars into this kind of system, active offensive cyber operations. And now most of it is blown. I think that, I don't know, I'm guessing, I think Julian may have some hidden away which he has not yet released and would like to barter for some sort of limited freedom. But it's so messy that the deep state is in control here. I don't think Trump would lose much at all politically if he went through and look what he says about these things now. So he says one thing during the campaign, another thing. So I don't see that as a problem. And I think that if we're going to be sober analysts here, we have to realize that Trump is not his own man. that the deep state is much more powerful, actually.
Well, I agree with you, Ray, but nonetheless, there is a perception. I mean, he'll have Julian Assange on trial, but the New York Times won't be on trial. The Washington Post will not be on trial. So people, his supporters will say, well, you're putting on trial the guy who actually helped you win election, while the people who are out to get you, who've been trying to destroy you from day one, they're not on trial. So the perception will not be good for Trump. I mean, he already has a problem that he's not really delivering what his core supporters wanted from him. And so, you know, he's continuing essentially the Bush foreign policy, no change at all from there. On immigration, I mean, you read these tweets from Ann Coulter and her fans, you know, they don't think Trump has delivered anything at all on immigration. So, you know, he already would have a difficult re-election on his hands. And, you know, a trial of Julian Assange is not going to help him, to say the least.
I guess my reaction is that's far too logical, George. There's not much logic in the body politic now, and the media would be the ones that would would be to tell the American people how terrible Julian Assange is, how he mucks around everything. So the impressionable people would, I think, not really be very disturbed if Trump went ahead and did Assange. Well, that's just my opinion. This is all very speculative, of course. You may be right.
Chris, sorry to interrupt. We have a question.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that Trump, it's really not America first, it's Trump first. That's Trump. And to show himself going after Assange would be politically advantageous to him. He could say, see, I'm not in his I wasn't involved with this Russia WikiLeaks thing. I just got Assange. So I also disagree with you, George, but that's maybe the first time.
Chris, we have a question from chat for you. Someone has asked, if we can't convince the mainstream media that they should be taking a stand for Julian and WikiLeaks on a moral or ethical basis for human rights, can we use self-interest to get them on side? Do you think that they will eventually smell the danger to themselves and begin to turn towards the light, so to speak?
No, because these people, most of them aren't journalists. They're highly paid celebrities, people like Rachel Maddow. Remember, these people are making sometimes millions of dollars. I mean, I'm an old newspaper reporter. These people couldn't report a story if you put a gun to their head. They're poseurs. They play the role of journalists. They're not real journalists. And you can see that. I was at Joe who talked about the funeral, or Margaret, I can't remember. I guess it was Margaret. I mean, that is our state religion. And the high priests of that state religion are these media celebrities. They're not only highly compensated for it, but they are part of that inner circle, part of that power elite. So I think that journalism, at least in the United States, has been so degraded and corroded, and much of it is essentially these courtiers masquerading as journalists, that what's in their interest. They will do anything that's good for their career. They will serve the centers of power, no matter how duplicitous those actions may be. You have the old New York Times, which are where I worked, and I think certainly, as Joe has pointed out, the legal counsel for the paper is quite aware of how dangerous that is. But right now, the New York Times is on a holy crusade against Donald Trump on behalf of the Democratic Party and Hillary Clinton. And I think that myopia and that service to the Democratic Party establishment has kind of blinded them to everything else. I mean, the language, and let's be clear, I detest Trump, but the language that the paper uses to describe Trump, I was never allowed to use language like that in the paper, and I covered people like Slobodan Milosevic or Bibi Netanyahu. So yeah, there's this, the state of American journalism is quite distressing. And I've watched it over my career. I mean, I began over 30 years ago. So I think that we have to be clear that most of these people aren't really even journalists, and that they will shift whichever way the wind blows. They don't stand for anything other than their own remuneration, their own celebrity, and their ability to remain within the inner circles of the power elite.
Now, the last time I interviewed you for the Nefajay stream, Chris, we talked about the shift of the audience towards shows like Jimmy Dore, where you see Jimmy Dore's getting hundreds of thousands of hits per video, where CNN, I see, are getting like 25 or 30,000 hits if they're lucky. And I know that you subsequently have actually appeared on the Jimmy Dore show in an incredible segment. I think it got cut up and put into 3 different videos, which are on Jimmy Dore channel, which I recommend everybody take the time to go and watch. And sitting alongside Jimmy Dore on a near daily basis is Mr. Graham Elwood. Graham, welcome to the stream. Just unmute you. Hi.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Now,
okay.
I know you were just telling me today too, you'd been reading Chris's books.
Yeah, so one of the most eye-opening books I've read is Death of the Liberal Class, and I want to touch on some of the things that you guys are, like Chris was just talking about, on how journalism, but here's the thing that I want to point out as someone I've been a stand-up comic for 25 years. I've done over 300 episodes of TV. I've hosted game shows. I've been in show business for the better part of 2.5 decades. And one of the things too that is what they've done, and they, I mean, maybe as Ray was talking about, the CIA or the deep state, whatever you want to call it, they have made it impossible for any artists to challenge the system. Now, when I was a kid in the 70s, I was turned on to comedians like, Lenny Bruce, George Carlin. I mean, I watched Steve Martin. I thought he was hilarious. And then when I started getting into comedy in the late 80s and 90s, there was Bill Hicks, who was calling out the first Gulf War blatantly. And so when the media became corporatized in the 80s, it took one of the things, and this has to be part of their strategy. People really listened to artists in the 60s and 70s. Every musician had an anti-war song. There was an anti-war tone to just about everything you watched, TV shows, all of it. And that's all been bought and paid for. Jimmy Dore, and who I've known for 20 years, we've talked about this. There's like maybe 7 progressive comedians out there, because guess what? You get penalized if you're calling out the ruling class right now. I made a decision. I lost work a little over a year ago. I have a whole movie review website and stuff like that. And I was hired to do a movie review game show. And then they saw my Twitter feed, and my Twitter feed was going after corporate Democrats that were selling out single-payer healthcare in the state of California. And I got fired for that. So they've made it clear to artists, you better shut up or we're going to pull this gravy train out from underneath you. And as Chris just pointed out, there's not much of a difference between, Rachel Maddow is just a sitcom entertainer or a late night talk show host.
Not funny.
And you can't be, the only political you can be is a Bill Maher type. He's a useful idiot to them. He's just the sort of funny left-wing Sean Hannity of late night TV. He's, Bill Maher blamed Jill Stein.
He's also an Islamophobe. He's a racist.
Yeah. And he's part of the problem in Hollywood. He's a multimillionaire. I mean, look, when the first Iraq war started, he said, those guys doing the drones in Orlando they're cowards. His show got pulled off the air. They sat him down, said, Bill, get your mind right, and you can come back on corporate TV. The other thing too, I'm a filmmaker. Show me where there's the Deer Hunter or Apocalypse Now for Iraq and Afghanistan. They won't make those movies. They won't show you the horrifying aspects of war. I did a documentary, Afghanistan, where I did comedy in Afghanistan for the first in 2004, and there's footage of me in an operating theater where there's a kid that got hit with an IED, and they're doing surgery and they're prepping a child. None of the festivals took this movie. So they've made it So, you know, if I was still hosting their game shows and being a funny comedian, I can do, you know, the only political jokes you can do in Hollywood are Trump's hair, his orange skin, but you can't sit there and say Obama dropped 26,171 rockets in 2016. Everyone's like, whoa, easy. When I talk about the fact that Obama let the banks steal my house, I was one of 5.2 million people that lost their home to foreclosure. My neoliberal Hollywood friends don't want to hear it. They just don't want to hear it because everyone's been bought out.
Wow.
Which is like, I made a clear decision, man. When I lost that gig last summer, I'd been doing my show, The Political Vigilante, on YouTube at the behest of Jimmy Dore. He said, Graham, people want to hear your story. And I made a decision. I'm going to keep doing this. It might cost me work. I mean, I've had to start the progressive comedy tour with Ron Placone because regular comedy clubs aren't going to hire me to go in there and talk about that both parties are ridiculous. When I do that in the middle of the country, it resonates with people. We've done shows in red states. We did shows in Arizona, and there were people in the audience who I know were Arizona Republicans. And when I said both parties, they want to keep us divided. They want to keep us red state, blue state. People were applauding. Like, you know, Hedges, you turned me on to who Fred Hampton was, man. Like I learned about him a month ago watching you on Jimmy Dore's show. And I tell that story to people about the Rainbow Coalition, liberal friends of mine. And they're like, what? They didn't know it existed.
That's
I'm
why
from
they killed
Chicago.
him, and that's why they killed him.
Yes. At the age of 21, they put a bullet in his head.
He was 24.
Bullets.
Yeah.
Yeah, 24.
Yeah. They killed him because as long as he was a Panther, they might have killed him. But, you know, COINTELPRO but once he started reaching out and building a real poor people's coalition in Chicago, he was dangerous.
Yeah. You can't do that. And I think when it is dangerous. Like if I just, and I see, I have so many friends of mine that are comedians that are smart and funny, and they have huge social media followings. But as was discussed earlier, they're in this, like, as I read in the Black Agenda report, it's called Trump derangement syndrome. They've gone bugfuck nuts. I mean, excuse my language, but they're blaming Susan Sarandon. Can you imagine if Hollywood lefties blamed the re-election of Nixon on Jane Fonda? Like,
well, and also who are their allies? You know,
right.
The FBI, the Democratic Party, Mueller. I mean, once these are the people who are, you know, you've thrown your lot in with, then you should start questioning, you know, where you are, because these people are not our friends.
No. And they all work. Look, when people talk about the corporate media, I say they also own, you know, any sitcom, any big studio giving you funding. I mean, Comedy Central, any of the outlets that I would try to get work on, they own all those too, man. So there's no way they're going to hire me. There's no way I could make a, you know, I mean, it's not a coincidence that they stopped showing, you know, Vietnam was when they showed war on TV. We don't see that now. There's no talk of Yemen. If I tried to do a movie about Yemen, that would never get funding. You have to kind of weasel it in, like the last Star Wars movie, the Han Solo movie. There was a whole thing in there about weapons manufacturers are the worst people in the galaxy. And I was in the theater like, wow, they let that sneak in? Like the CIA let that get into this big budget movie? But that's the only way you can do it, is if you sort of dress it up. But you can't flat out say the Trumps, Obamas, the Bushes, and the Clintons are all buddies and they've all been screwing us for decades. You can't say that. You got to pick a side and play their game. It's professional wrestling.
Well, the CIA, I learned this from Oliver Stone, they have a whole office in Hollywood. Mm-hmm. and all they do is reach out, vet scripts, you know, the same way with the military. I mean, that's why you get this horrible racist film, American Sniper, which looks like something that Goebbels would have produced. But, you know, the military, and then they'll lend you all your equipment and or Zero Dark 30. There it is. The CIA got its own movie with a completely fictitious account of how Osama bin Laden was captured and killed. So yeah, it's pervasive. It's academia, it's entertainment, it's news. I mean, we have, as John Ralston-Saul correctly points out, undergone a corporate coup d'etat in slow motion, and it's over. And as Julian and Jacob Appelbaum in their book Cypherpunks point out, they are creating electronic forms of surveillance that are cementing into place a dystopia that, you know, even the Stasi state, you know, never dreamed of.
Let me quote Lenin just for a second and say, "Что делать?" What are we going to do?
So you're quoting Vladimir, not John?
No, not John Lennon. We know what he wants to do, and I agree. But Vladimir Lenin, or whatever you want to call him, he wrote this tract and it says "Что делать?" That means exactly what is to be done. And I find this conversation very enlightening, frankly. But I keep being bothered by the notion that, hey, we still haven't really faced up to how we can get around this, get over it, or well, certainly we're not going to acquiesce in it. Certainly we're not going to throw up our hands and say, oh, God, this is really awful. No, what are we going to do? Что делать?
Well, large campaigns of non-cooperation to cripple and destroy the system. I'm not saying that we're close to it, but that is the only mechanism we have left. And again, as Joe has pointed out, you see it in the streets of Paris. Yeah. We don't have any other mechanism. We haven't even talked about climate change, which is now accelerating at a pace that even the most pessimistic climate scientists never predicted. And these people will drive the human species over a cliff for short-term profit. They are so myopic and so stunted, as the late rulers of any empire are. Joseph Tainer writes about this in The Collapse of Complex Societies. No, we have to build movements to wrest power from their hands. And if we don't do it soon, I mean, quite literally, the human species will go extinct. I mean, climate scientists, the reason they're so terrified of going above 2 degrees Celsius is because of feedback loops. And they know from studying Venus, which used to have water and is now 800 degrees, exactly how feedback loops work. So once your polar ice caps are gone, once the temperatures rises to such an extent within the oceans that they become dead zones, once the monster storms and the flood, I mean, everything starts feeding off of each other. And then it's a runaway freight train. You can't control it. And they've done mathematical models, which should be disseminated more public. They should be more publicly discussed than they are. They're hardly discussed at all, which have anywhere between a 70% die-off and a complete extinction of the human species. And these are the people who have our fate in their hands. And we have no time left. And they are not reformable. They are systems managers. I will draw on my training as a divinity student who serve systems of death, quite literally. And if we don't obstruct and wrest power from them, and that means overthrow and it means revolution, we're finished. We're completely finished.
Yeah, it's the one thing that's giving me hope is I'm starting to see more and more people waking up, to seeing, like, Jimmy Dore go from 2 years ago, 100,000 subscribers to 400,000 subscribers on his YouTube channel, to see people gravitate to my show, and more people such as myself of waking up. I'll admit, I was, probably your typical neoliberal Hollywood person. I voted for Obama twice. I thought he was going to hope and change. And when he started drone strike in the Middle East, I didn't really speak up as much as I think I should have. And now that's over. And I think that's the one good thing I'm seeing from Trump is we're seeing the most vulgar version of what presidents have been doing. I always say Obama, when he sent, his drones were better because they had rainbow flags on them. And so I think people are waking up to the fact that the whole system's broken, and they're starting to wake up. When I see the March for Our Lives, when I see those high school kids and you poll that age group, 60, 70% of them are calling themselves socialists because they're just like, I saw the capitalist system take my parents' house and they lost their retirement and they lost their jobs to globalization. So I'm out. That's the thing that at least gives me some hope. I agree totally, Chris, that people have to really walk out. Like I always say, you can't have your protests on a Saturday. You got to do what they're doing in France, which was 2,000 coordinated protests a couple weeks ago. And we need to do full-on walkouts because look at what I'm pointing to this positivity in the sense that, and maybe I'm overly optimistic, but look at the, what was it, 3 red states where they had teacher strikes, and they struck in red states and they won a lot. I mean, it wasn't like groundbreaking. It wasn't, but that to me was like, if you can strike in a red state, and then I hear the DSA is opening up more chapters in the state of Texas than any other state, I go, I think people are ready. And I think it's what you talked about earlier. We need to cross the divide and do what Fred Hampton did and say, look, we're all screwed. We got to get rid of this red state, blue state business. And we got to go, there's them, the 1%. And then there's all of us. And we're all getting screwed on this because, as Susie said earlier, poverty and people being out of work, there's that transcends every demographic.
Graham, what you just said about Jimmy Dore is what gives me hope, because the political shift across the world has been in the wrong direction, by and large. Is there a cultural shift in a good direction? And the other thing, this is actually a question I'd like to ask every single person on the panel individually. Graham, you just sat there and explained to us that there is no incentive, whatsoever for you at a career or an economic level to make the moral choices and ethical choices that you are in doing what you do, but you still do it every single day. And I want to know, why is that?
Well, I think it comes down to, and then after after I answer this question, I got to split because I literally got 2 gigs tonight. But I'll say this, for me, it just comes down to, when I read that we have basically 11 years to turn the planet around, and if we don't, it's lights out. So, by 2040, what am I going to sit there and do in 2040 and go, well, I got a lot of corporate TV gigs because I didn't buck the system while I'm sitting there floating in my apartment because LA's underwater. I mean, I have no choice, in my opinion. And also, fortunately, the thing that I've seen in my 20-some year career is that the corporate media controlled everything when I started. Now it doesn't. I mean, Jimmy is a fine example. He's my inspiration. He's making a pretty decent living saying whatever he wants. It's just not on NBC or ABC late at night. He's doing it from his home, and people watch all over the world. So, there's these Patreon, YouTube, all these things that I use for my show. They didn't exist when I started being a comedian in the late 80s. So from a financial economic standpoint, there's ways to keep my lights on in my 1-bedroom rent-controlled apartment, thanks to Obama letting One West Bank steal my home and not prosecuting Steve Mnuchin when Kamala Harris was Attorney General of the state of California, that I can pay my bills and still make a living. And so there is an economic structure in place for us to work. And also morally, I just have to do it because I have to be able to look myself in the mirror.
Well done. Thank you so much for being here, Graham.
Thank you.
Appreciate your support. And Jimmy's been here multiple times too on our streams. He's been an absolutely fantastic supporter. So thank you so much, and good luck at your shows tonight.
Thank you. Nice to talk with you, Chris, and everybody. This was really cool.
Yeah. I know it will have made Graham's day to get to talk to Chris.
That was pretty sweet, man.
Fantastic. Margaret Kimberley.
Yes.
You have had the courage to call it like it is, even if that risked alienating, multiple journalists and activists around you. You are one of the people who refused to go with the lesser of 2 evils. Why is that, and what makes you do what you do, even though you're unlikely to ever be on the cover of Time magazine for it.
Unlikely? No, that's not going to happen at all. You know, we've made reference to these celebrity journalists. They're not even journalists. They're you know, Rachel Maddow's a mouthpiece. That's, you know, not even being a reporter. But I see how serious things are. You know, the scales fell from my eyes, so to speak. And I went from being most of my life just a regular Democrat. It's embarrassing to me now. I used to defend Bill Clinton because, you know, the evil right wing were after him. But I started to see, it started with the theft of the presidency in 2000. That was a big turning point for me, realizing that we don't have a democracy. Meeting new people, writing for Black Agenda Report, meeting people who were far at the time to the left of me, and just giving myself the opportunity to learn new things. So part of me is I try not to be hard on other people who aren't quite where I am yet, because that's where I was most of my life. But once you see it, you can't go back. I can't go back to defending Democrats. I can't go back to saying Hillary Clinton would have been a better president. Oh, isn't it so terrible? She lost. Oh, you know, Trump is some unique evil. He's not. You know, and I don't care that they, you know, have this, you know, week-long pageant about George W. Bush so they can help prop up a dying system. And so once you reach that point, I think you become a little more courageous. At least that's what's happened in my case. So my personal struggle is to push myself forward and others forward so that we do have a plan of action. I don't want to just sit and watch people in Paris. I wish I knew more about it. I wish I knew more about French politics, but this is clearly groundbreaking. And it is something that we need here. But people here have tried, but they crushed Occupy. But that was during a Democratic administration. It was when Obama was president. So that doesn't make it impossible. It means it's something we have to learn from. Others have, Chris mentioned the ecocide that we're going through now. And a few days ago, Barack Obama bragged about the degree to which he increased oil production. He said, yeah, you can applaud me. I, you know, produced more oil. Well, hello, that's climate change. Trump has been president for not even quite 2 years. This problem didn't start January 2017. So all that to say, there's no going back once you see the light. But I'm, as hard as it is, I'm glad I've seen it, and I'm glad to be part of this group of truth tellers, because I believe we can accomplish great things. I believe we can inspire millions of other people to join with us. I don't think that we have to be this small group that sometimes feels alone. I don't think that's our fate. I don't think so at all.
Thank you so much for that. I'm getting complaints about my mic, so I'm actually just going to pull out my...
Ray McGovern. Ray, you, as a retired intelligence professional, had every opportunity to stick your heels up on Cape Cod, and instead, look at what you are doing. Why is that? Why are you speaking truth every day, supporting the world's most at-risk whistleblowers and journalists?
Well, initially, Susie, it was seeing the prostitution of my profession of intelligence analysis. Was very, very sad. I know some of those people that invented the evidence to justify the war in Iraq. That was hard to watch. But then as I became conscientized, as I became to learn about some of the real problems, even more cosmic problems, I realized that, I have 9 grandchildren. Some of the older ones already out of college. One just came back from his freshman year, stomped into the living room and said to his parents, my son and daughter-in-law, we just had a lecture on the environment and biology and what's going to happen. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Dad and Mom. Thanks a lot. Whoa. Now, it just seems to me that people my age, or people with this stripe of hair, have very little to lose. And we can't just sit back and say, oh, God, we're lucky. We'll probably be dead before before you can't live here on this globe anymore. Let's go eat, drink, and be merry. Well, none of us are like that. For God's sake, we've got to do something about this. And we can't be, in my view, we can't be sidelined by the traditional American imperative that you don't do something unless you have a reasonable expectation that you're going to be successful. Okay? I mean, who wants to be laughed at? Who wants to be said, oh, what'd you try that for? But we have to get over that. Okay? We're going to be unsuccessful. I like I.F. Stone. He famously said, look, to be in this business, you're gonna lose. And you're gonna lose, and you're gonna lose, and you're gonna lose again. The trick is to stay in with good companions, to keep your sense of balance, and realize that after you lose and lose and lose, one day there'll be someone who thinks the way you do and has the courage that some of you do, and that will change things. So my view is this. If my youngest granddaughter, who's 5, can't really expect to have clean water and clean air when she gets to be my age, if she makes it, what does my conscience tell me that I have to do? Well, I have to do something. And I don't know exactly what it is, but I know that I have an advantage here because, well, I'll finish with this. American people don't like old people to get beat up, okay? I know that because it's happened to me, and I know that Hillary Clinton and others got me beat up. I got thousands of telephone calls and emails, okay? So this is an advantage. So if anybody's looking on who's my age or even older, you've got this benefit that you get this advantage that you should cash in on. Young people are looking. They're wondering what the hell's going on with these parents, like my grandson who said to his mom and dad, thanks a lot, you know? And so they need the kind of example that we had during Vietnam. They need people who have moral authority, Rabbi Voskow, Rabbi Herschel, Dan and Phil Berrigan. They're not around anymore, so it's up to us. Now, that's kind of good in a sense, because we have to waste time trying to get the institutional church or the other institution that formerly had a claim on moral authority. They're not working anymore. Just like in Nazi Germany, they can't find their voice. So we got a voice. We have to use that voice. And I don't know exactly how we band together to cause this kind of revolution, but that's what we're talking about. Chris is exactly right. And as Dr. King said, there is such a thing as too late, and we're almost there now.
Well, Susie's gone. Chris, would you answer that same question that everyone's been asked?
Well, I come at this from a different angle, and that is having spent 20 years on the outer reaches of empire and watching what empire does. I began in Central America in the early 80s, and I watched every president do it. I was 5 years in Central America, 7 years in the Middle East, 3 years in the Balkans, and then I was based in Paris covering Al-Qaeda. And the empire is the true face of white supremacy. The mask is off. It is brutal and violent. It is about the theft of the resources of others and the subjugation, almost always of poor people of color, with all of the accompanying lies that go about implanting democracy or liberty or fighting communism or whatever canard they throw out to justify their crimes. So that by the time I came back to the United States, and I went to El Salvador straight out of seminary, actually, I had a very clear understanding of the evil of empire, what corporate power was about, how it would stop at nothing to amass its profits, how brutal and violent and amoral it was, and how the ruling elites, Republican and Democrat, were completely in sync with this machine. And I think that very few Americans, with the exception of African Americans and Native Americans who have been internal victims of empire, have a really clear understanding of how truly evil empire is. So by the time I came back to the United States, and this was in the end after 9/11, I think I, because of my experience, grasped that the problem was the system, that I wasn't caught up in political personalities, and I was watching within the United States, and this is what happens in the twilight or the late stages of empire, because empires hollow themselves out from the insides. That's why our country's infrastructure is collapsing. That's why half the country lives in poverty or near poverty. But what they do is the harsher forms of control on the outer reaches of empire, as the homeland disintegrates, are migrate back to the homeland. Militarized drones, militarized police, wholesale surveillance, loss of civil liberties, including due process and habeas corpus, capturing systems of information. This is the fate of all empires in the terminal stage. Thucydides, when he writes about the decline of the Athenian Empire, he says the tyranny that Athens imposed on others, it finally imposed on itself. And I think because of that experience, I was able to see more clearly when I came back who we are truly and where we're going and how dangerous it is. And I will echo what Ray says. I mean, being a war correspondent is just one Pyrrhic victory after another. You walk into a village where the Serbs have massacred people, they cut the roads, and in Bosnia they would have snipers shooting at us. You file your story, you document the murders, the massacres that they carried out, so at least they couldn't kill anonymously. At least these people had a name. And but you knew you woke up the next morning and would do it again. And when I was in Sarajevo, we lost 45 foreign reporters who were killed. My photographer was shot 3 days after I got there. And in the end, I think that I don't share America's cultural mania for hope. What empowers me, what I think, again, let's go back to the long, 4 centuries long nightmare of white supremacy that African Americans have endured. It is that resistance is perhaps often the only freedom you have. And I use it in my talks and people have probably heard it. But in the end, I don't know if we will survive as a species. I don't even know if we'll win. But I know that these corporate forces have us by the throat, and they have my children by the throat. And in the end, I don't fight fascists because I'll win. I'll fight fascists because they are fascists. There's a moral imperative to this struggle, which I think Julian understands. And if we want to look ourselves, if we want to stand with any kind of autonomy or dignity or sense of moral autonomy, then we must resist, even if we don't succeed. And we can't get caught up in the tyranny of the practical, otherwise we never will succeed.
Well,
and on that, I'm going to check out because.
Well, Chris, I had one follow-up if I can.
Yeah.
There've been plenty of American and Western correspondents that have had the same amount of experience, particularly in the global South, covering these wars, and yet they usually hang out at the American embassy. They get briefed by the American officials there, and they never lose their cultural point of view, this Orientalist view towards others. And they come back to the U.S. and continue to support basically the agenda of the empire. What was different about you? Why are you special? Because you are. Why weren't you more like one of those other foreign correspondents? And how did you get along with them, by the way, while you were there?
Well, I hated them. I mean, you know, in any war zone, only 10 or 15% go out. The rest of them are handout people. They, you know, they eat out of the palms of the embassy officials. And we should be clear, it's very good for their careers. You know, the New York Times loves it. I mean, they love that kind of access. You know, I didn't look at them as journalists. I came out of, I don't think it's accidental that I came out of seminary steeped in the social gospel, liberation theology. James Cone, the greatest contemporary theologian in America, who just died in April. I had a language. I mean, I understood that the moral life was about standing with and giving a voice to the extent that you can, or lifting up the voice of the oppressed. But I also understood the evil of institutions. Reinhold Niebuhr writes quite a bit about it, and how in the end they'll crush you. They always get you in the end. And so I think that was kind of, it made it easier because I never expected to be rewarded. I never thought that the New York Times was going to think that, you know, and I finally, as you know, clashed with the New York Times quite publicly over the Iraq War. So I think that my academic or my theological background was helpful, and I think I just went with a different mission. I mean, I was freelancing in Salvador. The Washington Post offered me a job, but said you had to go back and cover like Montgomery County or something. I said, well, I came to cover the war. I didn't come to build a career at the Washington Post. How I ever ended up the New York Times, I'm sure the New York Times management is still scratching their head on that one, because I didn't come through the paper. I was hired from the outside, very rare. So I think that was it. I think that it was never about my career. It was about something else.
Terrific.
And I'm, you know, I have a certain understanding for war reporters who will come into a war zone and don't want to put themselves at risk. I consider that actually a pretty sane and rational response, but they shouldn't be there. And because of that, a lot of it was driven by fear. They became tools of the empire. And, you know, as you correctly point out, that was probably 85% of them.
Well, thank you, Chris, very much.
Chris, I'm so sorry. Before we let you go, I have to ask you one question too, because of your experience with the area, the region, and that's about Ecuador. We've been interviewing some Ecuadorian activists who have been outside the presidential palace in Quito, involved in some amazing demonstrations. They are hitting the chain fences with coins to show that Moreno has sold out the people of Ecuador. Is that another possibility, you know, that there could be some type of overthrow of Moreno because he really has completely betrayed his base, and that could be a situation that could completely change where Julian is at present?
Well, he did. I mean, especially when you look at the campaign and how he presented himself, he was clearly selected by the imperial power, by the United States, and they knew in advance that he would do their bidding. You know, you'd have to be in Ecuador to understand how fragile, and I'm not there, how fragile his situation is, so I can't answer that. However, that's very heartening because I hadn't heard that. It's very important that pressure be brought on Moreno, and it's very important that pressure be mounted in the streets of London. And I will tell you, you know, I'm in Princeton, New Jersey, but if they bring Julian here, I'll be out on the streets here because that's the only hope we have for him, and that's the only hope we have to hold back these rapidly closing walls that are cementing into place a very frightening corporate totalitarianism.
So the updates that we have from Ecuador, just for your benefit, are that the ex-Vice President George Glass has been imprisoned on false charges and is currently, I believe, on day 49 of a hunger strike. So wow. There's a bunch of activism happening around that. And that Moreno had deposed or fired the entire Supreme Court, which was in itself a violation of the Ecuadorian constitution. So there's major issues around that. And then, of course, people are very upset that there's now US military flyovers in Ecuador, and of course the reinstatement of the old base, which is also in violation of the Constitution.
Right, and they didn't even give them a base in Miami. As Correa demanded.
Don't get a base, they just have to get a bunker at the drone air base.
Yeah, no, well, that's great. I lived in Latin America for 6 years, and I also lived in France, and I kind of wish, you know, we had a little more of that spirit in the United States. They're great. They're, you know, especially those leftists in Latin America and the French leftists I admire them and feel completely at home with them. And we need more of them here. We need to follow their example.
Hopefully the day may come. But
Right.
for all that we kick the shit out of the US government all the time, we have many Americans like yourself and many others in support of this movement, and Julian Assange and WikiLeaks, you know, many hundreds of thousands in the Occupy movement, every movement beyond that. Standing Rock, spectacular example. There are good people who care, and there are good people who are willing to stand up.
Yeah, and hopefully, you know, I covered the revolutions in Eastern Europe. I mean, you keep going out there. You are where you should be, and there used to be just a few kind of flaky Lutheran clergy walking around Leipzig, and next thing you know, there's 500,000 people on Alexanderplatz. So we all know where we have to be. We can't despair is a sin, to quote James Cone. We have to be where we have to be. We have to fight the fight we have to fight, and then we have to have faith in the end. That as Daniel Berrigan says, the good draws to it the good, and I think the good does draw to it the good. Maybe not in our lifetime, but it does come. But it isn't going to come if we don't get out there and we don't fight for what's right.
Amen.
Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Thanks for doing it, Susie. Yeah. Okay. It's important. Bye.
Bye-bye. Joe Lauria,
Yes.
you had a very, very long career in corporate journalism, and yet here you are running Consortium News, which is a publication with an incredible legacy of taking on the greatest power in the world. How in the hell did that happen, and why have you chosen this life? Why do you do what you do?
Well, I don't know how to do anything else. I've been working on newspapers since I was 8 years old in high school and college. And I always felt that this was a job that had a power greater than political power, because our job is to hold people with political power to account. And most of my colleagues want to live vicariously through these powerful people. They want to be close to that kind of political power. And they don't understand the power that they have, that I think is more powerful. When I was 19, I was working on my college paper as the editor-in-chief, and the New York Times offered me the job as their campus correspondent, a stringer on City College of New York, not far from where Margaret is probably right now. And I didn't want to take it because there was something inside of me that said, I can't do this. I can't go down that road. And my colleagues were saying, you're insane. These jobs don't grow on trees. And I made a very fateful decision to take that job. So I used that to work on a Providence Journal Bulletin, Rhode Island. But then I quit it all and went to Europe for 8 years and bummed around on odd jobs and lived in Germany, went to East Germany a lot, and had to come back and grow up. About at the age of 30, went back into journalism and covered the UN for 25 years. First for the Daily Mail in London, then the Daily Telegraph, ultimately for the Boston Globe and the German Press Agency, and then the last 6 years with the Wall Street Journal. And that was like the last straw. I spent 6 years at the Wall Street Journal, probably the paper that I was least in line with in terms of its political point of view. But when they started to suppress stories that I'd pitched to them or had written, stories about the Palestinians going before the UN, I was at the UN headquarters for 25 years, that they didn't want to run this, they would take out of my stories that 130 countries recognized Palestine before the vote to give them observer state status at the General Assembly. That they turned down twice a pitch from me about this Defense Intelligence Agency document that predicted the rise of the Islamic State and blamed the US and the Gulf countries and Turkey for supporting this proto-Salafist group in eastern Syria that this document in 2012 said could turn into an Islamic State, and exactly did 2 years later. They didn't want to run that story. That undermines the whole war on terror narrative. During the last 4 years working at the Journal, I began writing for Bob Perry at Consortium News. I was on a contract reporter for the Journal, so technically I could write for anybody else I wanted to. And I wrote under my own name. And that first story was for Bob about the Palestinians and that vote. And because I got fed up with the Journal, and I started publishing things with him that the Journal editors were rejecting, which is why Bob Perry set up Consortium News. The word consortium was to create a consortium of mainstream journalists, as Bob was and I was, to come together and publish the stories that they couldn't get in their own papers. Bob started because his earliest Iran-Contra stories, where he named Oliver North, he gave the world that name, was rejected by AP. They didn't want to run it. It was mistakenly run by the Spanish Wire, had been translated and put out. It's the only reason the AP published it in English, because it was already out in Latin America. So Bob had the same kinds of problem at Newsweek, where they would spike stories that was not good for the country, he was told. And he started Consortium News in 1995. So I started working for him about 7 years ago. And eventually, the best thing that happened to me was the Journal let me go, and they cited my articles in what they called opinion pieces, which I call analysis. So they were talking about Consortium News. So basically, writing for Consortium News cost me my job at the Journal, which was really liberating for me. I went to the Middle East for the last 2.5 years and just came back to the US this year, and I actually arrived in Washington the day Bob Perry died, which was January 27th of this year. And some friends, including Ray, supported me to be the successor, to try to, no way to replace Bob, but to keep the thing going. So I stuck around, and I got an incredible opportunity to actually practice journalism for the first time without compromise, and to be paid even 3 times better than the Wall Street Journal. Well, it's just an incredibly great gig, because it's very rare, and I'm very lucky. I paid a big price, because while I was inside the mainstream, I was always trying to push a story here or there. I picked my fights, and they published some stories not exactly the way I wrote them. Occasionally, I would sneak something in when I knew the senior editors had gone home. So late at night, I worked with younger editors, and I got a story in about how the CIA probably assassinated Dag Hammarskjöld, the second Secretary General. I don't know if that was, I think, the beginning of the end for me, because it was some months after that I was let go. So it's a struggle to be within the system, but I learned obviously a hell of a lot of how it works. I also think that the work of journalism, the skills that the people at the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times have are excellent. It's their political agenda and their point of view is the problem. So I learned a hell of a lot about journalism, how to get a story, how to vet it, and how to write it. So there were positives, but the political side of it was the issue, obviously. And I was writing international affairs based at the UN, so I wasn't covering, house fires and car crashes and stuff. That's kind of neutral. So I ran up against it, and I'm very, very fortunate to be doing what I always wanted to do, which is do the real work that a journalist has to do, holding the real power, the power of the politicians to account with a greater power that I think we have.
Have you felt that pull of the necessity to perform journalism? The reason I ask this is because I covered over 50 live events in New Zealand, and none of them because I wanted to be a journalist. I interviewed everybody who's anybody in the political sphere and activism sphere in New Zealand, and none of that was because I wanted to be an interviewer or a reporter. I did it because I could see our messages from the ground were either skewed or completely silenced. And my entire media team, and I used to say this to each other all the time, if not us, then who? If we don't go to this demo today and we don't film it and we don't send it to all the international press, who's going to do it? And this was the constant driving force. And we'd even argue with each other, be like, oh, I've got every reason under the sun not to go tomorrow. I've got to go and do this and that and the other thing. But if we don't go to this NZ for Gaza march, who's going to tell the world that 10,000 people marched for Palestine today? Who's going to do it? If not us, then who? Have you had that same experience of that drive of the necessity?
It comes down to a natural curiosity that you want to know what's going on. You really want to find out what's going on. You want to be near the events that are important. And then you want to tell people about it, as many people as possible, because it's important. And you're just driven by that individually, but you're doing a huge public service if you're actually doing the job the way it's intended to be done. which is to find out as close to the truth as you can about very complex events like international affairs, where you have nations competing or clashing with each other from their interests. They have competing interests. This is a great dramatic tale when you've got conflict in the world. And yet the American press, as the British press, tell it only from their own point of view. Like the American position is the only, and our little allies in Europe, we can include what they have to say. But there's one line at the bottom of those massive stories before the invasion of Iraq. Saddam Hussein says that they don't have WMD. That's what they call a balanced story. That one sentence in a 1,500-word story. In other words, you have to be neutral and take every nation's point of view. Everyone has a story to tell. And if you're really a good journalist, you want to hear them all neutrally and then tell those stories and weave it in and then try to explain to the public how it's happening, what it means. And so it just comes down to having a natural desire to know what's going on and to tell people about it. And I like to talk, as you can see. So I like writing. So I tell people what I find out, but you got to find it out first. That's the harder part, because you got obstacles, plenty of them in the way.
For me, time and again, and that was my wake up moment. This is what really like got me in the beginning, was when I began to find out information that there was no reason or excuse for not being on the 6 p.m. news, and turning on that television and there's nothing, looking at the New Zealand Herald website or the wherever website and there's nothing. And the first one that really did that for me was One Police Plaza, because I was watching the live streams and it was impossible for that not to have been newsworthy internationally, that there is people occupying the headquarters of the NYPD and and the echoing of the "We Are the 99%." It was just resounding in every direction. There's so many people there, and watching those streams and then going to all the major news websites, nothing, not a word. Turning on the TV, and it made me think, what else in my lifetime hasn't been put on the news? What else hasn't been written about in the newspaper?
Exactly.
And that was a huge shock to me, because in that instant, I realized that my entire idea of what had been going on for 30 years was tailored by external forces. And I felt like, as a consumer of media throughout my life, right from when in school, when they say cut an article out of the piece of news out of the newspaper and bring it to show and tell and talk about it to your class, what good is that exercise if what's actually news isn't in the newspaper? And that just really did me in. And then the second thing that followed up from that was when I was witnessing events on the ground and I was witnessing reporters come to report on the occupation, seeing them ask questions and get answers, and then looking at the product that they produced and what actually went to press, and seeing the vast discrepancy and the almost criminal smearing and skewering, and that it made me understand that journalism is a fundamental public service and it's not being provided. It's not being provided by the corporates. And that was the moment where I realized, I mean, my One Police Plaza taught me that the news is bullshit or covered up or never even spoken of, but seeing on the ground the reporters completely failing to do their job was the moment that I realized it's on us. We have to do it. We have to provide for ourselves the services which these corporates are too corrupt to provide.
Well, omission is the big sin of the corporate media. What they leave out of the paper or cut out of stories really tells the tale, more than deliberate lies. Although they do smear people, as you say, on occasion when they feel like they need to. This is the mission of a site like Consortium News, to provide what the corporate media leaves out, or to provide an angle that the corporate media is ignoring in the stories they do report. Simple as that. We have a small budget. We have few writers. We're doing the best we can. Like during the Bush funerals, I dug out of the archives a whole bunch of stories Bob Perry had written about George H.W. Bush that I knew was not being talked about. I didn't watch 1 minute of the coverage, but I knew what was going on. Like I said earlier, that's where they create myths, where you really see how corporate media creates myths during a funeral of a president. So I pushed out all these stories about the nefarious things that H.W. Bush was up to. Ray wrote one of them, in addition to those archival sites. So this is the mission of the Consortium News, and I'm really lucky, as I said, to be finally doing journalism. the way I feel it has to be done. So
Well,
thank
we
you.
are really lucky to have you here and being a part of this movement.
Well,
It's
appreciate it.
considerate.
I don't know. I just fell into this, but I appreciate you bringing me in.
Oh, I just think you're amazing. You have all of the experience that I lack academically and professionally,
Yeah.
and just.
Well, you know a hell of a lot more about Julian than everybody on this panel probably put together. So I learned a lot from you about him, and I appreciate you doing this.
Oh, I wouldn't go that far. I mean, Ray knows Julian personally, and many other people.
I'll stick with what I said, Ray. I'm sorry.
Yeah,
no, fantastic too, Susie. You're doing a tremendous thing here, and you're driven for the same reasons you're asking all of us why we're driven. We should ask you, why are you doing this?
I'm doing this because I understand that the people and the system of control that want to take Julian out are the same people who targeted me in New Zealand, almost everybody I knew in the activism realm in New Zealand. They're the same people that are why Ed is living here. They're the same people who are why Ed can't go home, why I can't go home. I mean, to be honest with you, I'm this close to being stateless myself. I very, very rarely talk about it. The chances of my passport being renewed next year are somewhere between zilch and none. And the New Zealand government is now holding secret court hearings to revoke the passports of so-called threats to national security, where they don't notify the defendant that they are revoking their passport or their entire citizenship, not just their passport, and where the unnotified defendant is not allowed to have any defence counsel. There is no defence counsel. It's prosecution only, secret hearings. It's been occurring in New Zealand. It's on the basis of legislation that was passed in 2016 to enhance the abilities of the security services to do exactly this. And I have documentary evidence that I have been deemed a threat to national security. So for all I know, my passport has already been revoked. This is the Orwellian world that we live in. And so Why do what I do? Because I couldn't let them win in New Zealand. I couldn't let them, I had the understanding that what was being done to my entire country, every single man, woman, and child in it. And so I could not choose myself over everyone. And primarily it's a product of my upbringing, because I grew up in a country that believed it was strong enough to stand up to the greatest powers in the world. We believed very much in our sovereignty, and every single thing I have experienced since 2011 has proven to me that there is no sovereignty for New Zealand. We are nothing but a satellite byproduct, we're complicit. We're complicit in all of it. Our spy bases are involved in targeting in Afghanistan, where our military has been exposed to be involved in war crimes and massacres in Afghanistan. We are, as the NSA would describe it, a partner in the global network. And no New Zealander agrees with this. I don't know a single one that agrees with this or that would agree with it. We are all staunchly against war. We have a huge anti-war legacy and history, and the government does not give a shit. The politicians do not give a shit. The media support the politicians and the government, and they're all run by the security agencies. So what was my choice? My choice is lie down and let my country exist in name only, or stand up and say, this is not freaking okay. And no matter how many times you try and run me off the road, I'm still going to tell the truth. And that's that, you know?
Absolutely. We were going to ask George about him, but I guess he gave up on us. I want to very quickly answer Ray's question, actually Lenin's question, what is to be done? And the word propaganda, I mean, obviously from the root of Latin propagare, to propagate, to put out information. And once had a neutral kind of meaning. It doesn't anymore. And we are doing this here, putting out, before there's an uprising, before there's a revolution, there has to be people speaking and giving the masses of people, or the ones who are watching us, the information that they need to open their eyes to understand what's going on. I think that's what we're doing. That's what's to be done now, Ray. We could talk about it, at least at this point, before people can be spurred to spontaneous action. Maybe
Oh
that's
my
not good
God,
enough.
I've just got it. Like, in terms of what we can do. What we can do is become WikiLeaks. And I don't necessarily mean that we need a secure Dropbox or we need to, work with whistleblowers, but we can. I look back at the last 8 years of my experience, and how many things would we never have known were happening and never been influenced by if it wasn't for citizen journalism. If there wasn't live streamers at One Police Plaza, if there weren't people taking photos and talking about it on social media, I never would have seen what I saw. I never would have witnessed those events online, which means I wouldn't have known that the mass media was blacking it out, which means I might not have taken the next step of going down and getting involved in actions. I might not have ever become a journalist or done any of the work I've done over the last 8 years. What we need to do, yes, we need to go to the embassy, yes, we need to protest, but what we need to do is become the media, which is exactly what Julian has done. He's not only has he become the media, he's done it so well that he has eclipsed their every achievement to infinity. And this is what we have to do. We have to take on that spirit of providing for humanity the services which are not being, and that's what Jimmy Dore is and Graham Elwood is. It's what all of you, it's what consortium is. It's what all of this truth-telling is about. We wouldn't be sitting here doing the truth-telling if the truth-telling was happening all around us. We're doing it because it wasn't happening.
If Ray wants to respond to what I said, otherwise we should bring Simon in, who's been patiently waiting.
Thank you very much. First of all, I need to confirm if you can hear me clearly enough. I've got a new setup with the earphones.
Yes.
I'm so sorry, great. Simon, that you've waited so long.
I've been having the pleasure of listening to you all speak, and it's been awesome, to say the least. Where to start? I really don't know where to start. There's so much. Ecuador, I think, is probably the best. Why do you
support Julian? Simon, why do you support Julian and WikiLeaks?
Okay, why do I support Julian? I'm just trying to think, okay, what happened first? I'll go chronologically. The first thing, before I came into contact with WikiLeaks, before they existed, actually, I very much related to what you were just saying, Susie, about if not us, then who? And I am not keen on public speaking, and I am not keen on writing, but I've had upwards of, not a huge amount, but about 20 articles at the max published on independent news sites because of issues that are being ignored in the media. And the first one that I picked up on was in 2004, was the confirmation of Susan Rice. What specifically drove me to write on the issue was the fact that Barbara Boxer, Senator Boxer at the time, had asked an impertinent question about the role of Susan Rice with respect to the Iraq War and fabricating evidence, aluminium tubes, I believe it was. And the headlines about this incident were, the one that stuck out in my mind, and that was on everybody's lips, was, "What's up with Barbara Boxer?" Like, this was the strangest thing in the universe, that a senator would question the integrity. And the actual words were, Susan Rice actually said, "Well, we can have this discussion any way you like, but I would appreciate it if you didn't impugn my integrity." And this is the way these fork-tongued people speak. And so I wrote an article about that was published in Common Dreams, pointing out the matter of the slight logical issue about not being able to question such major things in the national interest. So bring it forward a little bit. WikiLeaks, it was perhaps a serendipitous event in some ways, perhaps just a bit of an accident, but Julian Assange put out an email to supporters, potential supporters, and this was the sort of cottage industry beginning of WikiLeaks. He was operating a public internet service provider. He was at least affiliated with one, and put out a message to all the people who were members of it back in 2007. just to drum up support, and I indicated interest, and we got talking by email. So I saw a little bit of the inside. Just from 2007 was mainly just in that year, and then the last interaction I had with them was 2009. Never met Julian, never spoke. It was all just a little bit of digital interaction on the philosophical level, because I'm a philosopher. I got a PhD from the University of New South Wales and lectured a bit at the university here at UNE. So that's my background. Now I want to bring it forward to the present, and particularly what Susie was saying about we need to be WikiLeaks. I have mentioned before on the Vigils what the things we were discussing at the time about the trajectory of WikiLeaks, the possible paths that WikiLeaks could take. The most distinctive thing, and I've said before about it, is that what WikiLeaks became was a fallback position. Now, that might seem crazy because they've done such incredible things. There is so much information. But what was always the vision was that it would be citizen journalism on steroids. The raw data is one thing, but then there's the analysis, and that's the problem, right? There is so much in there, and WikiLeaks has had so much impact, but it's only been the tip of the iceberg, considering with respect to the potential impact. Right, the documents haven't been gone through in anywhere near enough detail, and it hasn't been brought out well enough. And this was realised from the outset that you can't. Well, you can put the information out there, and it was a compromise. That seems to have been arrived at with the major newspapers, and that was what happened when WikiLeaks really took off. They made deals with Guardian, New York Times, Le Monde, Der Spiegel, etc. But that wasn't the original hope and vision. The original hope was that there was going to be some kind of coordinated citizen journalist. There would be data mining going on. There'd be research. There'd be packaging of the information. There'd be wide distribution, and there'd be a dominance of the narrative. Right? And we know that that's not what has happened. Right? The height of WikiLeaks' influence was the impact of the Manning releases, and when they were taken up by the various major news agencies. And you could say, arguably, the election was another major issue, but that was major in less clear ways and more politically tangled ways. That what happened with the media at that time, at around 2010, that was about the high watermark, right? When there was actually WikiLeaks was cool, and WikiLeaks was cool with journalists, at least some journalists. Right? And then there was a sort of tapering off from there, and a real souring. It was rather rapid, actually, and the falling out with the Guardian, for instance. Right. So connecting this more with the present again. I know there's been an issue with the development of the website for this particular movement. As we know, it's sort of stuck in 1.0 release, if not prior to that, 0 point something. And the developer, one of the developers of the website, has been perhaps a little ambitious in trying to make it a facility for everybody who's got information to do this kind of citizen journalism, drop-in activism, as what's the kind of expression he's used for it. So now there are certainly teething issues with it because it's not here after 4 or 5 months, but the inspiration is certainly in line with the original vision of WikiLeaks. And whether it's going to happen whiz-bang through a new website, or whether we're going to find some way of working together more effectively in sharing information and getting analysis out there, getting facts clarified in the public space. some way of doing that which is more effective than the traditional methods that we've been using to date. That was the whole vision and hope of WikiLeaks at the outset. And I think it's inevitably destiny. It's going to happen somehow. This is the nature of communications increasing. And with little hubs forming. And this is an example. What's going on right now? We've got, 6, 7, 8 people talking in real time, doing essentially something like what an intelligence agency is doing at some level. This is a new development. It's got all sorts of problems. It's everything new has teething issues and major ones. And sometimes things just fizzle out and die. And sometimes they do spectacularly well. In some ways, this movement has done spectacularly well. In some ways, it hasn't. But a particular example of what can be done besides the new website, which is in development, and the sooner it comes into existence, I think, the better. Apart from that, for instance, there's a new channel on Discord which started in connection with WikiBees, which is a similar thing to what's going on here with less high-profile people. There has been a channel started called Real-Time Journalism, specifically targeted to this issue, and also specific the particular matter of Ecuador. Now, with respect to Ecuador, for instance, as Chris Hedges just left here, he knows a lot about the world. He knows a lot about Ecuador, got a lot of experience, and he said mentioned that he didn't know that particular issue about George Glass, and he thanked us for bringing that up. So this is another example. Here we are all together, information circulating, getting from where it originates to somewhere where it's important for it to arrive, getting some acknowledgement. So some of us are trying to accelerate this process, and Suzy's been a part of that as well, and encouraged this development with the Real-Time Journalism channel. There is a huge story here with Ecuador. It needs to break in the English-speaking media. We are digging out the details now. It's been leaking through little bit by bit on the WikiBees sessions that we've been having over the last 3 weeks, month or so, via a particular citizen journalist called Jose Rivera. And his Twitter feed is a goldmine of information on that. Unfortunately, it's mostly in Spanish, and it's very hard to work your way through to get all the little gems. My last post on the Real-Time Journalism channel was a commitment to be digging stuff out and making a summary for the beginning of an article to be published in English. I've already got some interest from other journalists. Elise Stranahan, who's been on here, has put a post in that channel. We need to break this story. One thing about this story, so this movement is distinguished by being, the name Unity for J says it all, right? It's to bring people together over a crucial issue. But with the discovery of the fact that George Glass has been persecuted, he's on a hunger strike, he's just about to die. For those who don't know, he's the elected vice president of Ecuador. He is suffering these conditions because he continued the legacy of Correa, and which also Moreno was elected to preserve. When Moreno did the 180 on policy, he basically started a major persecution of all the people, all the previous supporters of Correa, who were concerned to continue their support for his policies.
Simon.
Yeah.
Simon, you are absolutely right that what is going on in Ecuador right now is important and historic and incredibly pertinent to Julian's situation. We are holding these vigils every single week now, rather than once a month, and we will discuss it at length. Today, we had an amazing achievement, which was starting on time, which we usually never do. And I'm determined that we're going to finish on time, which means we have 15 minutes left of the stream. I would beg you to please come back in future weeks, and perhaps we bring Jose from Ecuador, some of the Ecuadorian journalists on as well, and we get this message out, because I agree with you, it is so important, and the work you've been doing with WikiBees sessions midweek is greatly appreciated as well. Thank you so much. And also, like you were saying before about how information circulates, one of the greatest things about this movement for me personally has been seeing panelists and participants who've met on the stream then going and doing related work together, which has just been wonderful to see. So thank you so much. I have to introduce now, we have with us Cassandra Fairbanks, who's a journalist in Washington, DC. She's at an event right now, but is joining us. She's been doing a lot of reporting about Julian and WikiLeaks recently, and she is very much in the know about what's happening in the political circles. So hi, Cassandra. And she was a founding member of this movement. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can hear you fine.
Yeah.
So I am currently at a Christmas party, and Kellyanne Conway and Sarah Sanders and everybody are here. We actually just went up and asked Sarah Sanders if the White House has any take on Julian Assange, and she grimaced like somebody punched her, and so that they didn't have any position on Julian. So that was a little scary. But how are you guys doing?
We're doing fine. Where is the party? Are you in the White House?
No, I'm in DC though. Okay. I don't know if I'm supposed to stay where I am.
I see.
Technically not supposed to be using a camera in here.
I see.
Cassandra, we were talking earlier about what would be the impact on Trump if he does let Julian, be taken.
I think it's going to be devastating for him. His base and his supporters and his most outspoken on social media supporters are huge supporters of WikiLeaks, because they elected Trump to go after the deep state and to drain the swamp and all this stuff. And those are exactly the things that Julian has been doing. Granted, he's doing it, Trump is doing it from the very far right, but the goal is the same. These people support taking down the establishment. And if he goes after Julian Assange, he's signaling to his base and his supporters that he is no longer interested in going after the swamp or the same people who have been going after him for 2 years. And it makes him look weak. And nobody is going to vote for that. I mean, people are going to be very upset. A lot of people. So I'm hoping that he comes to his senses. But from what I've been told from friends of mine who work in the DOJ and the State Department, they're saying that their goal is to arrest Julian before Christmas. And that is obviously so that people pay less attention to it, which is very scary. So
I actually shared one of your tweets earlier on tonight. I shared screen and showed people that you had said that if Trump lets this all happen, as you say it may, and says nothing and does nothing, that you are going to go nuclear.
Oh, yeah. I already have a plan for what I'm personally going to do in response to this, but that'll come later.
And do you expect other independent media voices like yourself to join that?
I hope so. I think that there will definitely, at least in my circle, the very pro-Trump media, there's definitely going to be a massive backlash. And I don't think he's going to be expecting it to be as bad as it will. I've talked to a lot of people privately. They have a lot of different plans in mind for how they're going to personally respond to this. But it's not going to be good for him. So hopefully somebody knocks some sense into him before this happens.
So George was right. He was saying the same thing before, George Samuli. And Ray and I and a few others were disagreeing with him, but you're backing up that this will hurt Trump. If Assange is arrested.
There's no doubt in my mind at all that this will hurt Trump. His supporters voted for him because they wanted somebody to take on the deep state and the establishment. And these are the same people that Julian Assange has been going after for 10 years. If he goes after the one person who's actually been fighting the fight that he claims to fight, it's not going to bode well for him. I mean, it's going to make him look weak. And there's no way around that. And people didn't vote for him because they thought he was weak. They wanted somebody who was going to shake things up and not give us the same old stuff and not, toe this neocon line. He's surrounded by neocons right now. People are already upset about that. And if he doesn't do something to stand up for WikiLeaks, like a pardon or whatever, it's going to hurt him in 2020, especially with the fact that he's not doing anything about social media censorship, which is hurting the left right now too. He's on thin ice with a lot of people, and I think a lot of people are very disappointed in his first term already. And I mean, I won't vote for him if he lets Julian be arrested. Like, and I know I'm not alone.
Cassandra, you were one of the last people to see Julian at the embassy, the Ecuadorian embassy in London, prior to all of his communications being cut off. What can you tell us about him from that time?
He was in good spirits when I saw him, as well as you could expect, but this was 3 days before the isolation began. You know, obviously, he looked like somebody who's been in a room for too long. But he looked well, he looked healthy, he looked okay. And from what I've heard now, he's in a lot worse shape, which is terrible. Yeah. Kellyanne Conway is right next to me. I don't know if you guys can see her, but there's a lot of commotion next to me at the moment. I'm sorry. Yeah, he was good when I saw him. He was smart, he was intelligent, he had all his wits about him. He didn't seem like, you know, I feel like I would be losing my mind if I was in isolation for that long, and he was not. He was great, and it's very unfortunate that 3 days after that, the isolation began.
Well,
sorry, I always ramble on here.
Thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate that you've taken time out from your other engagements to give us those messages. So thank you so much. And we're now doing these vigils every week, so we hope to see you again soon.
Thank you for having me.
You're so welcome, Cass. Okay, we have with us Eleanor Goldfield. Eleanor, I can't see you right now. Can we turn your camera on? Let me try. Or maybe your camera is just stick it over. Eleanor, are you with us? Okay, I think she will be with us in a second. So Eleanor is a slam poet and activist and an amazing, amazing human being. She has a show called Act Out. You may well have seen her being promoted pretty extensively by Lee Kemp, another amazing comedian and supporter of this movement. Eleanor has done a slam poetry reading that she wrote herself about Julian Assange and WikiLeaks, and we are hoping to close out the vigil tonight with a performance of that from her. But in the meantime, let's get some last words from our panelists. Ray, your stamina is, I was saying to one of my friends today that, like, the first people I always hear back from are the people who are the biggest names. John Kiriakou, Ray McGovern. These are the people who instantly respond to my emails, my messages, who are sitting here from the beginning until the end. Ray, you amaze me in that way.
Well, we like to be part of your team, Susie. I mean, we're all in the same boat here. I do have a couple of suggestions.
Please.
I don't like the fatalistic business when they get them, or when they bring them here, or what we're going to do then. I don't like reactions. I like proactions, okay? I think that next time, maybe we could be a little bit, maybe you could require people to come up with a plan of something to do, okay? Before they say anything else, what are we going to do, okay? Who knows where we'll be this time next week? But maybe we'll have another week after that. But what we do. Then the other thing is, it'd be good to have some color. It'd be good to have people of color on, whether they're Ecuadorians or whether they're whatever, and more women. Now, it was great to have Cassandra in there. I don't agree with her about Trump. I think that he's already weak, and that's for obvious reasons. He's not his own man. So, but it's nice to have input from a more very local personnel, so to speak. So those would be my suggestions for next time. Take them for what they're worth. But again, I just have to say that unless we get beyond the words, unless we figure out how to do something before Harrods, or seal off Harrods, or whatever it takes. I know it's hard, but I think even if we ostensibly fail, things that are done, actually actions speak louder than words.
I agree with you, Ray. Now, hopefully people did get a chance to read the press release we put out this week. So we had previously been doing a Unity for J Day once a month, where people had been doing banner drops and all various actions all around the world, which had been pretty successful. We have now made it so that Unity for J Day is every Saturday and Sunday, every weekend. So something I should have been pushing a lot more tonight, but is very much our intention, is that tomorrow people will go out, or today if you're in my area of the world, people will go out and will take action wherever it is that they are. It would be great if you're in London and great if you're in the UK. Sorry,
good.
message. But take action however you can and do it on the ground and get people informed and get people involved. And that is tomorrow, Saturday and Sunday, that we will be looking to do that. And you tag at Unity for J on any of the media platforms, or and we absolutely will amplify and will circulate that work. So this is very much an ongoing thing. As to how to get masses out on the ground in London, very interesting, Ray, that after we did the last emergency stream and we said we wanted people to come to Harrods, there was a significant, I would even say an insidious, but a significant pushback against that plan. And the pushback came from multiple quarters. And when I see that, I'm always a little bit suspicious, because whenever I see the same narrative being pushed from different directions, it tells me that it's being seeded by someone or someone's. And my overall impression is that they were actually quite desperate for us not to disrupt Christmas shopping outside Harrods. Now, the reasons I was being given why we shouldn't were things from, oh, well, we might offend passers-by, to what about the poor security guards at Harrods, to but actually Qatar owns Harrods, and maybe Qatar will complain to the Ecuadorian embassy, and they might, I think things are so far gone with the Ecuadorians and Julian that actually some complaints from the neighbours aren't going to make too much of a difference whatsoever. But these are the types of things that I was hearing. There was a pretty consistent resistance to that. Now, unfortunately, I'm not in the UK, because if I was, if this was in Auckland, I would just go down and do it myself, and I would rally the troops myself, and I would start that protest myself. Unfortunately, I'm not in London. So what we need is people who are in London who believe that there has to be this type of action on the ground to get down there and do it, and to not look for other people's permission, and to not listen to the criticism, because every valid protest action I've ever participated in, there was criticism. Wherever we were really going to make a difference, we were really going to hurt the powers that be, there was those voices saying, no, you can't do that, you can't do that. So at a certain point, you have to ignore that criticism and get out there and discomfort the comfortable.
Amen.
Okay, Eleanor, you're with us. I can see you now.
Sorry, my computer is aging. Planned obsolescence at its finest. Yeah, thank you for having me. I know that you said that you didn't. Sorry?
Oh, it's so great to have you here.
Well, thank you. And I know that you said that you wanted to end on time, and I'm throwing a wrench in that plan.
It's good. We've got 10 minutes.
Okay, grand. Well, yeah, I thank you so much for having me on here. And just to throw in something that I've been getting from some folks that I work with on the ground is the idea of separating the character assassination from the work that Assange does, because I think that it's becomes kind of like a point on the left to grab onto that sort of mainstream media, corporate media line that, oh, well, if you don't like Assange as a person, then you can't support his right to journalism, his right to speak, his right to create. Mm-hmm. And this is, of course, completely arbitrary because I don't know him personally. I don't need to know him personally to know that I think that he has a right to free speech. He has a right to journalism. He has a right to share what WikiLeaks finds. And so I think that that's an important thing that I've been able to talk to people with on the ground in terms of their perceived personal feelings about Assange, which of course are taken from that corporate media line that they don't really realize that they're getting, but they've taken in that perception of Assange as being a bad person, like on a personal level. And I think that decoupling that from his journalistic work could be an important point of really rallying more people around it, that it's not about whether you like someone personally.
Unfortunately, we have seen that. Fortunately, we've seen that come from Freedom of the Press Foundation, from Snowden, and from Trevor Tim, Executive Director of Freedom of the Press Foundation, and also from a number of NGO figures and even some mainstream media figures over the last couple of weeks. So I think that message is slowly getting through, that press freedom and human rights supersedes personality.
Right, exactly, and that's kind of I've kind of built that into this this spoken word piece that I wrote a while back about this issue and about Julian's right to speak.
And it's a phenomenal piece. I've seen it before, and I'd love to see it again. So please take it away.
Okay, everyone, grab a drink or. In the ashes of our mistakes. Shredded bits of paper, like confetti at a funeral. Someone has to burn. Between the lines, like crisscross lies, do you ask the light if it's good? A murdered messenger sent us a message. How easily, though, it got lost in the din. 'Cause didn't he sin? Yeah, he's an arrogant ass giving fascists a pass, or a hostage of Holy Rome, a rattler of thrones. Either way, his fate we do own. Either way, this leaking truth we do own. And if you feel like you're drowning, wake up. The argument's shallow, the precedent deep, and the road to perdition is steep and slick. Do you follow their lead? The leaks can't be damned, but the man is so easily damned. 'Cause secrets can't be kept, but lies have shelf lives far too long. Here is the empire's swan song, a failing and flailing hegemony, a Machiavellian tragedy, a grotesque dark comedy, an idiocracy. We are the players and the played. Must this show go on? I don't know this man, but I don't want his blood on my hands. As a child of empire, I am already soaked. Then buy me a beer and we'll talk about sin. But here now, I'm tearing down gallows because the ashes of our mistakes are choking out the light.
Awesome.
Phenomenal.
Thank you.
Absolutely phenomenal.
Thank you.
Guys, it's been an amazing, incredible, poignant night, and that's a brilliant close to it. Well, thank you. Joe, do you want to close the night? Any last words from you?
Well, I just thank everybody who took part, and I'm glad we're doing this every week, and I hope we keep doing it because that means he's still there and has not been taken. And Ray's right. We got to come up with some ideas, and hopefully we'll discuss them next week. Thank you again for having this, Susie, and for making me be a part of this. Appreciate it.
You weren't hard to convince. Good night, everybody. Thank you so much. Please get out this weekend and do whatever you can, whether it's with a stick of chalk or a poster or bookmarks in books at the libraries, or just speaking out online if that's all you can do, or getting out there with pots and pans and making some noise. Let's save this man one way or another. Thank you all. Good night.
you.